This is an interview with the Honorable Joe Mack Wilson, conducted on April the 1st, 1988, by Thomas A. Scott at Mr. Wilson's home in Marietta, Georgia. Mr. Wilson, I wonder if we could start by simply talking about when and where you were born, and are you a lifetime Marietta resident?
Well, I was born here in Marietta on Locust Street, which is near the site of the Maple Avenue Methodist Church, in December 11, 1919. I've been a lifelong resident, except for leaving for employment, and my years right after finishing high school and before I entered college.
Could you say a little bit about your family? What did your father do for a living? And
my father came to Cobb County from Douglas County in 1912 to work for a local jewelry store, and his work was that as of a watchmaker. And in 1914 he went in business for himself, and of course the business has continued until today, and being one of the oldest businesses in the county under the same family. He was a lifelong, my father was a lifelong jeweler and watchmaker. He taught me at an early age, at 14, to do the same type of work that he had done. And I did that type of work until I was doing that same type of work when I was at Georgia Tech. I was doing it at night and in the afternoons. And then later in 1945, after getting out of the Navy, I entered full-time with him in the business and continued it up until when my father died, he gave me Wilson Brothers Jewelers. And when I retired in 1983, I gave it to my son. In neither instance has a nickel ever changed hands.
Is that right?
That's correct.
Has the business always been on the same location on Church Street?
No, sir. The business has been all over the city of Marietta Square and in close environs.
Well, you said that you were born on Locust Street. Did you stay in that location?
No. As a matter of fact, I have the check, council check to Dr. Warren Benson, who took care of my mother and delivered me, then took care of afterwards, and the total amount of the check written on December the 11th, 1919 was $20.
Is that right?
So no, I moved into what I could call today a shanty over on Powder Spring Street, right directly across from the Marietta Confederate Cemetery.
I see. Is that's in the vicinity of the country club there?
No, it's not that far out. It's in the vicinity of where Frank Moore and Mr. Cubbage have today their auditing firm.
I see.
Right directly across from, almost from the entrance to the Confederate Cemetery.
Is it the original house is gone now?
It's been gone. Urban Renewal got it.
I see. So you grew up then on Powder Spring Street?
Yes, and then later moved to Maple Avenue in the city of Marietta.
I see. Were you born at home, or was it in Dr. Benson's?
I was born at home, and Dr. Benson's took care of my mother and me in my home on Locust Street, which that house has been destroyed since that time, and the property is now owned by the Maple Avenue Methodist Church.
I see. When you talk about growing up in kind of a shanty house, was your father struggling in the jewelry business at that time, or was that good housing in Cobb County?
No, that was even in those standards poor housing. And was he struggling? He struggled all of his life.
Did he?
And so have I.
The jewelry business was a tough business in those years. Was there a lot of competition, or just a little
competition
money?
and lack of capital and lack of ability to raise capital formation, and it was a lot of things. But I spent, of course, most of my earnings, which was nothing but a good living, on my family, and of course on myself.
Was when you moved to Maple Avenue, then that looks like that'd be a step up in the world.
It was definitely a step up. I described that shanty over on Powder Spring Street as one of those that you could, as the old folks would say, you could throw a cat through the floor, cracks in the floor. One of the big highlights of the year was for my father to give my mother a new linoleum to put on the kitchen floor to keep it cleaner, of course. But one of the main purposes was to keep the air from coming up through the floor.
I see. Did you have indoor plumbing?
No, the plumbing was a commode type of gadget, but it was out on the back porch.
I see.
And in the winter months, it got awfully cold out there.
Yeah. Was it enclosed in any way out there?
The commode? Yeah, it had a little offshoot of the building.
But not any heat.
It wasn't built. The building, the original house, was not built with a commode inside.
Was that common
to?
Was that common to add the plumbing facilities outdoors or out on the back porch, I should say, I guess a lot of the houses were built before you had indoor plumbing, and was that the common way to do it, to put it out on the back porch?
Well, you put it out on the back porch when sewage became available for disposal out at the street. Before that time, you had outhouses.
I just wondered, because I'd heard Mr. Guy Northcutt talk before about putting bathrooms on the back porches of the houses that the knitting mill had owned, and I just wondered
This place that I lived in, of course, those knitting mill houses were not the Hilton or anything like that, but they were good, sturdy housing, and Mr. Northcutt and all those looked after their employees. In those days, it appears to me better than they do today.
Really?
There was more genuine friendship between the employee and the employer. Of course, the wages were starvation by today's standards, but they were a good, solid living back in those days. And Mr. Northcutt was a pillar in this community for many, many years, and his family. They're fine people, fine people.
Did you go to Waterman Street School and
Yes, sir.
Marietta High School?
Waterman Street, and all those grade school years. And one year, it was the policy that you had to go to Haynes Street School, which is just about the site of the present Marietta Fire Department.
Right.
And Haynes Street, you went 1 year, and then, as I recall, you went from Haynes Street to high school. High school was located, a much smaller building than now, in the same location that it is today on Wynn Street, Polk Street.
So you would have been in high school then about the mid-30s.
I graduated in '36.
And so high school then was what, 8, 9, 10, and 11?
4 years.
So you graduated in 1936.
Youngest person in the class.
You were the youngest? Is that what you said?
Yes. The next youngest was Dr. Earl Benson.
I see. Who were some of the other people in your high school class? Any other, that have been prominent in the county?
Well, Harold Andrews Benson is a very prominent automobile dealer. Mack Smithwick became one of the largest Chevrolet dealers in the nation at Mobile, Alabama. Used to work for, all of these guys used to work for Mr. Jimmy T. Anderson. They got their training under Mr. Jimmy T. And they were all very successful in that business. But Dr. Pierce Allgood was in my class. A very fine orthopedic man in Atlanta. Still in practice today. Mr. William D. Little, a mortgage banker. Charles DeFore, who was killed during the war. Lou Sessions, who was either died or was killed during the war. Any numbers of very prominent citizens.
It's a pretty successful class then.
Well, you either were or you weren't. You either stayed in school or you didn't. And those that stayed in school in those days were considered successful. They might not have been the brightest among the bright, but they were usually had parents that motivated them to get an education, and they were bright enough to absorb what was available to them.
What percentage would you say of the children that started with you in the first grade actually made it through high school?
Oh, maybe 20%, 25.
What the rest
The rest
of them?
dropped out,
Mm-hmm.
took any kind of job they could get. You have to remember now, these times were awfully, awfully hard.
Yeah.
And they usually had to support the rest of the family, or they had to support each other.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have the luxury of switching around on jobs and switching salaries and so forth like you have today.
Mm-hmm.
And I graduated in 1936.
Uh-huh.
I could not find a job in Marietta, Georgia. Not even on the WPA.
Is that right?
And I had to go to South Carolina
Uh-huh.
and got a job digging ditches
I see.
for $15 a week,
Uh-huh.
40 hours for $15.
Mm-hmm.
And they took out 15 cents Social Security.
Hmm.
I lived in a boarding house in all over South Carolina.
Uh-huh.
And the average cost of board, meals, and sleeping, and I'm not talking about flop houses now, I'm talking about nice homes,
Mm-hmm.
was $5 a week,
Is that right?
room and board.
Uh-huh. Were you digging ditches for the government, or was
Yes,
it?
sir, on road widening programs, road work.
Uh-huh.
And I'll tell you this instance, is I'm down in the ditch, digging ditches with the rest of the crew,
Mhm.
which consisted mostly of blacks and a few whites, like such as myself.
Uh-huh.
The superintendent of the project came by on this hot day, and I had my shirt off, hanging on the limb.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, he motioned for me to stick my head in, come and to stick my head in the car, and he asked me a question. Can you type?
Hmm.
I said, yes, sir. He said, get in. I said, let me get my shirt, boss. That instant, he hired me on at $35 a week, which was unheard of
Well,
for a person like myself to be making $35 a week during the height of the
yeah, that
Depression.
was good wage then.
That was 1937.
Mm-hmm.
I was a young guy, single, and living like a king
Uh-huh.
on $35
Yeah.
a week.
Mhm.
I saved out of that, I had to send mama money home,
Uh-huh.
$10 a week.
Uh-huh. Why do you think that he picked you out?
Well, I would say a white boy down in the ditch,
Uh-huh.
and he might have had some conversation with some other people about that boy down in the ditch down there.
Mm-hmm.
But he just posed the question, can you type?
Uh-huh.
Well, yeah, I could type, and I took typing in high school.
Mm-hmm.
And I state that as an example of something that you might think will never be of any use to you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was of great use to me.
Mm-hmm.
It got me out of the ditch.
Mm-hmm. How would you evaluate the education that you received in the Marietta school system?
At that time, as compared with the rest of the nation and the rest of Georgia and the rest of Cobb County, it was superior. It was there, the opportunity was there if you wanted it bad enough
Mm-hmm.
and had the resolve to do it.
What do you think made it a superior education?
Well, the fact that you could hire, in those times, jobs were awfully scarce even for good teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And the Marietta system paid in those days, as it does today, more than the average school system.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly because of the uniqueness of the Board of Light and Water and those things. But they were able to attract outstanding teachers,
Mm-hmm.
even at those low wages of those days.
Uh-huh.
The opportunity was, if anybody wanted a school teaching job and they were good, they could. The ambition was to get on with the Marietta school system.
Uh-huh. When you say the uniqueness of the Board of Lights and Water, did the revenues from the Board of Lights and Water supplement the teachers' salaries?
Well, it did then as it does today. It supplemented all of education, which is, of course, about 80% of all education is salaries.
Yeah.
Teachers' salaries and supervisory salaries, all of education. And basically, it's the quality of the teacher standing in front of the class. And quality in our society is usually equated with what the wages they draw.
Uh-huh.
And you pay good wages, you get good people.
Uh-huh. So you're suggesting that Marietta had the foresight to find an extra source of revenue that most school systems didn't have when they used the Board of Lights and Water in that way?
Yes, sir. Unique.
Uh-huh.
Only maybe a half a dozen, and only today a handful have that same system.
Mm-hmm.
Dalton City System is an example.
Mm-hmm.
Marietta is probably the most, or the best example
Mm-hmm.
of the combination of revenues from utilities
Mm-hmm.
and using it for education.
Do you know who was responsible for setting it up that way in Marietta?
I don't know who was responsible, but I've been responsible for helping keep it that way.
Have you? Uh-huh.
I believe in the system.
Well,
Not everyone owns a piece of real property,
uh-huh.
which is taxed for education.
Uh-huh.
Practically every household has a water meter, a light meter, and
Uh-huh.
a sewage system.
Uh-huh.
That way you get everybody
Mhm.
almost, as
I
far
see.
as practical, to participate in the
Mhm.
education of our local community.
Mm-hmm. How long did you stay in South Carolina before you came back? to
I
Marietta?
came back in 1939,
Uh-huh.
and I had saved up several hundreds of dollars. And I decided, while I was digging those ditches and doing that office work, which is what I was referring to, $35 a week,
Mm-hmm.
I went on up to where I could make $100 a week
Hmm.
doing the same job,
Mm-hmm.
but more of it. In
Mm-hmm.
other words, the volume increased and my pay increased.
Uh-huh.
I'd make as high as $100 a week. I decided after rambling all over South Carolina and living in boarding houses and wherever, that I'd get an education.
Mm-hmm.
So I came home in 1939 and entered Georgia Tech.
Mm-hmm. Did you live at home on Maple Street when you were
I sure did.
attending?
Well, shortly thereafter, my father, while I was at Tech, my father built the first house in the city of Marietta with an FHA mortgage.
Is that right?
That house still is located on Maple Avenue,
Uh-huh.
further out Maple Avenue where
I
was.
see. Uh-huh.
That's the first house financed
Uh-huh.
in Cobb County, Georgia, with FHA money,
I see.
a mortgage, FHA mortgage,
Uh-huh.
built by Mr. Ed Stevens.
Uh-huh.
And Mr. Ed Stevens, my father not being a learned man and not knowing much about, the law and the mortgages and all those sorts of
Yeah.
deeds and those sorts of things, Mr. Ed Stevens helped him with that.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
As he did, Mr. Ed helped many, many people
Mm-hmm.
own their first house, and in
Mhm.
lots of instances,
Mm-hmm.
where they still live.
Did FHA loans become very important in this area after
It
that?
became fashionable, and everybody began to dream about having a home.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an American dream, that,
Mhm.
a part of the Franklin Roosevelt era
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that gave a lot of folks hope and made them realize those dreams.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't until Franklin Roosevelt that you had those sorts of
Mhm.
things that were people-oriented
Yeah.
instead of,
Mm-hmm. I gather you were a great admirer of Franklin Roosevelt then.
I still am. Greatest man to ever live.
So you like that approach of what you described it as people-oriented?
Collectively helping ourselves.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Were you in support of the public works programs, the WPA and so on?
Sure, I proved it, and everyone else did,
Uh-huh.
because no one else could get a job. Even the mill owners, and what we would call today the affluent and the well-off and so forth, who made money off the labors of others,
Mm-hmm.
they approved it because they didn't have any work for what
Mhm.
would normally be their workers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So to keep the community together,
Mm-hmm.
they didn't like it. I remember the rebellion we had in our community here about the NRA.
Mm-hmm.
It was a communist plot
Uh-huh.
because they were raising wages to 15 cents an hour.
Uh-huh.
Well, the local manufacturers group had only been paying 10 cents an hour.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a communist plot to come in and suggest that everybody ought to be paid 15 cents an hour.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard the old people talk to me about the WPA jobs. There's a lot of politics in WPA jobs. I couldn't get one because I wasn't inside the clique.
Uh-huh.
That's the reason I had to go to South Carolina.
Uh-huh.
But I can recall, for example, and he may be able to tell you about it today, Mr. Dempsey Medford,
Mm-hmm.
one of the finest men that ever lived.
Mm-hmm.
Across on Depot Street, across the railroad, from what is now the passenger station,
Mm-hmm.
in the ditch, digging ditches himself.
Huh.
A little frail man
Yeah.
trying to dig ditches.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
Well, I think Mr. Dempsey could probably tell you about that today, because I understand that his mind is real good, and he had one of those minds that had almost total recall.
I've talked to him a time or two.
Well, he's in a nursing home up here now, I understand.
Last I saw, he was in Powder Springs in a
He's
nursing
moved
home.
to one of these nursing homes up here above town.
Is that right? Well, how did the Depression affect the jewelry business?
Well, there wasn't any business, and you'd repair a watch and get whatever you could for repairing it.
Uh-huh.
And of course, the fellow that was wanting it repaired would shop it all over town,
Mm-hmm.
and he would make a conclusion that this fellow can do it best for cheapest.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way it was worked. There wasn't any business. I recall in the height of the Depression, Christmas Eve was the biggest day in the jewelry business.
Mm-hmm.
One Christmas Eve, I remember my father buying little cotton filled boxes and things that you would deliver gifts in.
Uh-huh.
And he spent, maybe $100
Mm-hmm.
on merchandise and on boxing and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
That Christmas Eve, at the height of the Depression, he took in 75 cents.
Is that right?
Not enough to have Christmas dinner.
Mm-hmm.
That Christmas, I got an apple and an orange,
Mm-hmm.
and as my personal gift, he gave me a used pocket knife
Huh.
that I remember had one blade broken out of it. It was a
Mhm.
two-blade knife,
Uh-huh.
and it had one blade broken out of it. And that's all he could afford.
Uh-huh.
We couldn't even afford shoes.
Mm-hmm.
Those were the days over on Maple Avenue,
Uh-huh.
when we were renting a house over there from a fine lady,
Uh-huh.
who later my father married after
I
my
see.
mother died.
Uh-huh. Who was she?
Ms. Annie Cross Young,
Uh-huh.
85, lives today. Of course, her name is Annie Cross Young Wilson now.
Uh-huh.
She was married to a guy by the name of a gentleman by the name of George Young.
Mm-hmm.
They had 3 children. And then he was killed in an automobile. Mr. Young was killed in an automobile accident.
Mm-hmm.
Years later, after my mother died, she and my father were married.
Hmm.
And I went, with some reluctance, I went up to the mountain where my stepmother lives now,
Mm-hmm.
and lived with them while I was going to school in Atlanta.
I see. Uh-huh. Well, did you ride the streetcar into Atlanta?
Well, we could have ride it, of course, and it went right on the corner of North Avenue and Marietta Street was where it's, you could get off the
Mhm.
streetcar. But and we had books of tickets to ride the streetcar,
Mhm.
but it was a sin almost to use one of those tickets.
Uh-huh.
We didn't use tickets except in extreme emergency.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very rarely did we ever use one going to Atlanta.
Uh-huh.
We would always, if we got caught down there after midnight or late,
Mm-hmm.
around midnight,
Mm-hmm.
we would catch the last streetcar, which was at 12 o'clock
Uh-huh.
at the corner of North Avenue and Marietta Street, coming
I
out
see.
of Georgia
Uh-huh.
Tech.
Uh-huh.
In the mornings, we would, everyone in town knew each other.
Mm-hmm.
We would get over at the corner of Allen's Drugstore, which is the southeast
Mhm.
corner of the square,
Mm-hmm.
And we would stand out there and, of course, hold our thumb out, and we would catch rides going into Atlanta. Without fail, almost, you always got a ride.
Yeah.
Because everyone in Marietta knew everyone else. And they knew what you were standing out there thumbing a ride for. That you were going to school, that you going to school. Now, the folks that worked in Atlanta back in those days, they carpooled. One person would own a car, and they would haul 6 people, the passenger and 5 others. And that way they paid the expense of the automobile. But coming home from Tech, we could always get a ride, say at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, coming back to Marietta, because the same fellows that took you in lots of afternoons would take you back.
Home, yeah.
Well, you get to the square and you'd walk home from there. But anyhow, the only time you used a streetcar ticket was when you were stranded. Now, even back in those days when folks would go to the Fox Theater for entertainment, the habit was for Marietans to come back by way of the corner of North Avenue and Hemp Hill, which was the corner of Georgia Tech, where the aeronautical building is now. Everyone went that way purposely to see if any of the Tech kids were stranded.
That's great.
We got a lot of rides.
That's about the same location where Lester Maddox had his restaurant, wasn't it?
Lester had 2 or 3 restaurants over there near Tech, and one of them was Pickrick, which was down towards Marietta on Hemp Hill, towards Westinghouse and towards Marietta, which was North Avenue then, which led you into what is now 41 Highway. 41 Highway was only paved to what is the scene now of Cumberland Mall.
I see.
It was 4 lanes to Cumberland Mall.
And you're talking about in the late 30s, early 40s
That's
that
correct.
you came out to Cumberland?
Early 40s.
Did you graduate from Georgia Tech?
No, they drafted me out of Georgia Tech, and I knew I never was going to be an engineer anyhow. I was going to go home and go into jewelry business. So I went in the Navy and stayed a while, and came home and took the discharge money. I believe it was about $500 they gave me, and bought jewelry with it. And my daddy and I went in business. Now $500 was just about the complete inventory. When I got back from the war, he didn't have a thing. He just sitting there. Almost giving up. And with me in there, we had a little energy in it. And he had a good personality and everything. And we didn't get rich, but we didn't starve either. And treated everybody, good. My father was a fellow who could hardly write his name, and yet he had all kinds of practical sense. Had a good mind, and had 3 patents from the U.S. Patent Office.
Is that right?
Yeah, I've got one I'd love to show you.
What did he?
Device that he and some others here, he dreamed it up, and they put it on the market.
Yeah.
Never made a dime.
What was it that they invented?
Well, this gadget that I'm going to in my living room now and get to bring back to you, I'm going to show you, and it was a cigar lighter.
Oh, okay.
I've kind of jazzed it up a little bit. He only put one of these plaques on here.
I see.
But I had some, so I just thought I'd put one on the front and the back.
The J.D. Wilson cigar lighter. Huh. Well, how did it work?
Push that down.
Oh, okay.
What happens? This wire goes to a dry cell battery. Under the counter.
Yeah.
This sits on top of the counter. That sparks across there, lights up that wick that you see there.
Right.
And you take your finger off. Fluid is inside that.
I see. Well, that's ingenious.
What motivates the spark? T-model Ford coil.
Is that right?
See the way he's rigged it?
Yeah. Well, I'd say your father should have been down at Georgia Tech too.
Okay. Where did he get his contact? When you push that down,
Uh-huh.
there's your contact right there. See the wire here?
Yeah.
See that there?
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Huh. Well, that's all right.
He also invented a gadget that put gold in teeth,
Is that right? Uh-huh.
vibrator.
Uh-huh. Huh.
Packed, in other words, they clean the cavity out,
Uh-huh.
then they take this gold amalgam,
Uh-huh.
and this tampering device, it was nothing in the world but a vibrator.
Uh-huh.
But he applied it to a small enough area
Mm-hmm.
that you could pack gold in a hole in a tooth.
Well, I'd say all...
But he could barely write his name now.
Uh-huh. How many years of schooling did he have?
I don't know that he had any high school,
Uh-huh.
and yet his father was a teacher.
Oh, is that right?
His father, his father, which would be my grandfather, he's an interesting story.
Uh-huh. Well, why don't you tell me about it?
Well, he was a clerk in a hotel in Atlanta
Uh-huh.
in 1860 or 61.
Uh-huh.
He decided he wanted to go to war, so he joined up as a volunteer in, I've got it all down in yonder. He joined up with the Confederate Army, a local company.
Yeah.
That was the style they did it those days.
Yeah.
And he entered as a private, and before the war, he ended up being a captain. And he was commissioned while he was in federal prison.
Is that
And
right?
didn't even know he was commissioned. He was in federal prison in Ohio,
Uh-huh.
captured at Mobile. When he left the Confederate Army, he came home and rather than go back to Atlanta, he settled in what was old Campbell County, which is now part of Douglas County,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
in an area called Dog River.
Dog River? Dog River.
Over in Douglas County.
Uh-huh.
And he raised, gee bird, 10 kids, I guess, of which my father was the youngest.
Huh.
My grandfather was born in 1839 and died in 1920. And my father was born, and this is the point I made, he was born in 1892, which would have put the old man
Yeah, that's 50.
above 50 years,
Yeah,
about 60 years of age. He born in 39
Yes.
now.
Well, be about 53, I guess.
Yes, sir.
Huh.
My father was the youngest of the children.
Uh-huh.
Little Dick Wilson died in 1920,
Uh-huh.
buried in Douglas County, Georgia,
Uh-huh.
as is my father
I see.
and my mother. They all came from Douglas County.
Uh-huh.
Pioneer Douglas County people.
Uh-huh. How old was your father when he died?
63.
So that'd put him up about 1955, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So after you came back from the war, then you had about 10 years that you and your father worked together.
Stayed together.
Uh-huh.
He'd go fishing one day and I'd go fishing the next.
I see.
I worked harder than he did, but he had more experience and more friends than I did. So we sold a little jewelry and repaired a lot of watches.
Well, when did you start getting interested in politics?
1939.
39? When you would have been about 20 years old?
49.
49. So you were about 30 years old and you're back from the war and you've been working with your father for about 4 years at that time.
5 years, something like that.
Uh-huh.
Then me and a young crowd, including Red Aston, Dr. Glenn Reed, and what would have been considered then a group of young Turks, decided to run me for mayor.
I see.
Against the establishment.
Well, Red Atherton must have been pretty young then, too.
He was. He's a good bit younger than I was. But I was the candidate. We all rallied behind Wilson.
So Atherton and Reed were and you were the leaders of the Young Turks?
I can't think of all the rest of them, but they were They were good, pretty good. Smithwick, Benson, all of those fellas.
Mm-hmm.
We were all,
Mm-hmm.
we were the outs trying to get in.
I see. Uh-huh.
And I was the candidate.
Was Harold Willingham one of the ends by that time?
He was an in.
Uh-huh. What about
He was the establishment.
what about Fred Bentley? Was he
He wasn't nowhere.
he wasn't anywhere yet at that point?
That's right.
Okay. And so
But Fred lived out in the county.
I see. Uh-huh. So
This
he
is city politics.
I see. Oh,
But now
okay.
Fred was practicing law in Marietta.
Mhm.
But to my knowledge, he never took any hand in the city politics.
City politics, okay.
But Willingham was part of the old establishment, although the establishment fought among themselves as who was going to get all the fruits
Uh-huh.
of public office.
Uh-huh.
The attorneyships, bank accounts,
Uh-huh.
all those sorts of things that they're still fighting over today.
Uh-huh.
But we were the kind of outsider, we were the outside,
Uh-huh.
and we were just a young bunch
Uh-huh.
wanting power
Yeah.
ourselves.
Uh-huh.
Oh, I would say, trying to get recognition.
Yeah. Well, how did they pick you to be the candidate for mayor? Did you go around,
Well,
did you ever-
modesty would have me say I was the natural choice.
did you actively solicit their support, or did they come and ask
we
you to
all
do it?
we all ran around together.
Uh-huh.
Glenn Reed was a big Kiwanian and went on to be a national president of the Kiwanis.
Uh-huh.
Red Acton, I don't have to tell you about him. He was a state leader,
Uh-huh.
a civic leader, and a municipal leader.
Uh-huh. So is this something that's kind of hatched in the Marietta Kiwanis Club meeting someday?
No, sir, no, sir. I wasn't a member of any Kiwanis club. I wasn't a member of anything organized.
Is that right?
Maybe with the exception of I've always been a Democrat,
Uh-huh.
and that wasn't organized neither. But I was the choice, and we ran. We ran a respectable race. Pretty good, rough, tough,
Uh-huh.
And we lost by 250 votes.
Is that right? Who were you running against?
Sam J. Welch.
Is that right? Back that far back? I
Mhm.
didn't realize he got
Sam
elected
Welch
for-
was an old liner, and
Uh-huh.
In retrospect, a darn good mayor.
Uh-huh.
We didn't think he's so dang good because he wasn't as progressive as we were.
Uh-huh.
But looking back on it, from an experience standpoint and an age standpoint, I would have to confess that we probably was trying to beat a pretty good man.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
But that didn't keep us from wanting power.
Yeah.
Whether we knew what to do with it after we got it would have been another thing.
Yeah.
But we never learned.
Was Rep Blair the
Him and
outgoing
Sam
mayor?
Welch was the two old antagonists
Oh,
that
they
fought
were?
each other.
Oh,
Now
I
Willingham, he would flip from one side to the other, although most instances Willingham would come down on the side of the winner.
Uh-huh. I see.
And he'd grin like the dickens, he heard me saying it.
Okay. What were
But
the...
Willingham was a power broker now, outstanding ability,
Uh-huh.
a very sharp intellect.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And he learned well. In fact, he gives me credit for teaching him everything he knew.
Is that right? Well, what were the issues that divided a progressive from an old liner in those years?
Well, we of course thought that the old liners were too hesitant to accept change,
Uh-huh.
and we wanted instant change.
Uh-huh.
We didn't want to wait for it.
Yeah.
We wanted it to come to us instantly because we knew so much more than they did.
I see.
And our experience was a lot less than theirs.
And your perspective on those kind of things
Was
changed
probably
with time.
probably a little better. I know mine have since those days.
Well, now, I would think 1949, of course, you had that boom time in World War II, but Bell Aircraft's closed its doors now, and Lockheed hadn't come in yet, but I guess this area was still booming to some degree,
Well, compared to what?
compared to the 30s and the,
Oh, it was heaven compared to the 30s.
So,
Yeah, the boom was still on.
so-
And money was still in circulation. Staple goods were still in maybe a little short supply, and goods and services were sought, and yeah, it was good. It was good times.
So the kinds of issues were that you needed more classroom space in the city school system,
Well, I
or
don't
more
know if we
sewers,
ever
or-
got that technical. They had what we thought we wanted, and we wanted to take it away from them.
I see.
We
So
could just do it better than they could.
okay, so it's mainly just a question of
Blind ambition.
Y'all wanting into power. Okay. Well, so you got beat by 250 votes in that race. About how many people were voting then, by the way?
Oh, probably at that time 6,000.
6,000. So
total,
hmm
both sides.
So a lot of voters by that time. In the city.
Yeah, we kind of went away and beat, but Jesus, fellas, we might be better than we thought we were.
Yeah.
You know, that sort of attitude.
Not too bad for an outsider, I guess.
A young upstart gang just starting.
Yeah. How did you go about campaigning in that election? Did
Walk
you?
from door to door.
Is that right?
Yes, sir. Or have your buddy walk from door to door. Or if he knew somebody better than you did, you went over there and both of you went together to see this guy. It was one-on-one. Ward politics at its best.
No real speech making, or didn't have to worry about that. Did you have
Only
newspaper
time,
ads?
oh yeah, we had newspaper ads, but we didn't have any television, of course. And the newspaper, of course, was always on the side of the ends, just like they are today.
Yeah.
You ride the horse that's got the, you plow the horse that's got the harness on.
Yeah.
And Mr. Otis and them ain't changed none. They ride Ernest Barrett or they ride Earl Smith. It don't really make no difference to them. The power structure always stays with the one with the harness on.
You think that's pretty true of small town newspapers, that they're not going to really ever have too much critical analysis, but always going to be on the side of the ends?
Well, it probably varies from community to community, but where there's higher stakes than newspaper which is the case here in Cobb, they're going to ride with who's ever in power.
What would you define those higher stakes as being?
Zoning.
You mean as they own property all over the county and so on? Is that what you're talking about?
Exactly. That's what's the real power in this county today. It ain't goodness and kindness and sweetness. It's who can zone what, where, and when, and for how much.
Well, after your first campaign in 1949, when was the next time that you decided to run for office?
I keep saying 49, and I don't know that I'm not confused. It seemed like it now that it might have been 59.
59, right before you ran for the
house. Because I got rich and famous, you see, from running as mayor. And I decided I'd run for the Georgia House of Representatives because it came an opening.
I see. So 1959 would be a little more logical.
I believe it is 59 instead of 49.
So you'd have been about 40 years old.
Yeah, I was 39 as I remember.
Okay.
And
well, that makes more sense. I was thinking Sam Welch was in right before Red Atherton, maybe, and.
Well, C.W. Bramlett came in there along that time in Marietta and was a very, very progressive mayor. A very progressive.
Yeah.
He beat Sam Welch. And he was part of the crowd. He inherited all of my old crowd. We all supported, of course, by the time that Sam Welch beat us, we had formed alliances. We had done decided he were the enemy. And so anybody that was a friend, was an enemy of Sam, was a friend of ours.
I see, yeah.
The old axiom, you know, friend of.
Sure.
Well, anyhow, we took on, we all got behind Mr. Bramlett, who was somewhat of a outsider and a long shot. But they had developed dissatisfaction with Mr. Welch, and as a consequence of that dissatisfaction, and with our help, we elected Mr. Bramlett.
I see.
Who was a very progressive mayor now, and a darn good one. He brought City manager was one of his ideas.
Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Mm-hmm.
C.W. Bramble.
Were they 2-year terms or 4-year terms?
2-year terms back in those days, and then we switched it. Harold Willingham and I switched it 4 years
Uh-huh.
after I got into the legislature.
Mm-hmm. So then, I'll check the dates in the newspapers, but then probably Welch was elected in 59 and Bramble in 61. And,
He was off and on Welch now.
mm-hmm.
Some years Rip Blair would be the mayor.
Mm-hmm.
Folks would get dissatisfied with Rip, and they'd re-elect Sam Welch.
I see. Okay.
Now, Rip Blair was Jimmy Carmichael's law partner.
Uh-huh.
And Rip was the establishment man.
Mm-hmm.
He represented all that was autocratic, aristocratic,
Uh-huh.
country club,
Yeah.
a good administrator, but it was always done in his crowd's favor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There wasn't no favoritism.
Yeah.
It was always in their favor.
Yeah.
He didn't play favorites.
Yeah.
It was just his crowd.
I see. Okay.
But he wasn't any different now from anybody else.
Uh-huh.
He was a very bright man, Mr. Blair was. Very, very bright.
Is that right?
Excellent lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
Had a reputation as a scrapper and a fighter.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And so did Sam Welch.
Uh-huh.
In fact, Sam Welch at one time was middleweight, amateur middleweight boxing champion of Georgia.
Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Well, now, did Jimmy Carmichael kind of just stay on the sidelines of the political scrapes, except for that race for the governorship that he had?
Yeah. He was a power broker,
Uh-huh.
influence man.
Uh-huh.
Worked at Lockheed
Yeah.
or Bell.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, he ran a lot.
Lived down yonder on near that cemetery on 41.
Oh, uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
His place now is a restaurant.
Uh-huh.
Then when he got rich,
Mm-hmm.
he moved up here on Cherokee Street in what is now Harrison Merrill's
Right.
house.
Yeah. Ivy Grove.
Ivy Grove,
Mm-hmm.
which seems to be the place all of them wanted to land.
Uh-huh. It's a nice house.
Well, it was Mr. Morgan McNeil's and them's old home place, and it was originally the home of the Freers, as I remember.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And
But Mr. McNeil is the one that made it a fine place.
uh-huh.
And you can see the marble influence if you go up there today.
Mm-hmm. And it's the
Marble.
Denmead house before that originally.
That's right.
Um,
Wasn't no man Denmead a mayor?
I think he was a number of times actually.
Yeah.
In
And
the
the
late
Denmead
19th
Street, of
century.
course, is named after
Uh-huh.
him. Denmead Street's about gone now.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Okay, so 1959 maybe was the year that you
I'm
ran for
pretty sure it
mayor,
was now.
and so that gave you some name recognition. And next year around then, you ran for a seat in the legislature.
Ran against a fellow by the name of Ed Kendrick.
Ed Kendrick.
He was the school person's candidate.
Uh-huh.
We beat him rather handily.
Mm-hmm.
And from that day on, I signed on to education.
I see.
For
So.
2 reasons. I believed in it,
Uh-huh.
and I wanted their support.
Uh-huh.
And I've had it
Ever since then.
ever since.
Mm-hmm.
Never been a time that I wasn't endorsed by
Mhm.
Georgia Educational Association.
So, 1960, you really weren't anti-education. It's just that he already had their support.
He had it staked out.
Mhm.
He was a teacher himself,
Uh-huh.
or worked in the school system, county
Mhm.
school system, Mr.
Mhm.
Ed did.
Uh-huh.
And he had their support because he was one of them.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't that they were anti-Wilson.
Mm-hmm.
They were just pro-Kendrick.
Uh-huh. Did the school leadership really have a lot of political clout?
Well, they didn't have enough.
Mm-hmm.
But they even went to the extent on Mr. Kendrick's behalf of passing Dixie cups around in the classroom and
Mhm.
putting pennies in.
Is that right?
Nickels, dimes, quarters.
Little kids?
Well, the idea was to get the mamas and daddies involved.
Mm-hmm.
It was a pretty good scheme,
Mm-hmm.
but it didn't work.
Didn't work that race.
But I don't think that was really a detraction of the organizational ability of education,
Mm-hmm.
nor it's awfully hard to take one segment of a society and let it dominate the political interest of everybody.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If you appear to be shoving your interest in front of everybody else's interest,
Mm-hmm.
then others lose interest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So you can't do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
I, of course, want every educational vote I ever got. I wanted it, and I appreciated it.
Mm-hmm.
But I had broader fields
Mhm.
than just simply education.
So you're saying that you can't be identified too closely with a narrow interest group?
But I don't think that's good
Mm-hmm.
for a candidate.
Mm-hmm.
I think he has to represent a broader constituency.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always attempted to do that.
Mhm.
But the first thing I embraced when I went to the Capitol was the Georgia Educational Association.
Uh-huh.
I went to them. I had run against you. I run against y'all's man. I was successful. Now what can I do?
Mm-hmm.
What can I do to make y'all proud of me?
Uh-huh. So that won them over at that point?
Well, it didn't win them over at that point, but the record speaks for itself
Uh-huh.
as to whether I'm for education or not.
Uh-huh.
And I am. I'm highly pro-education.
Was education the central issue in the 1960 race, or?
Well, it wasn't made an issue that we got up on a platform and shouted about education.
Uh-huh.
I've never met a candidate who wasn't for education.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
But some are more vocal about it than others.
Mm-hmm.
But we never got up on a platform and discussed educational issues.
Mm-hmm.
Had we gotten on a platform, I would have done my darndest to out-education him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But what were some of the issues in the race?
They're not issues.
No real issues?
They're personality races.
Uh-huh.
And still are.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Still are.
Mm-hmm.
To a great extent. An incumbent, of course, runs far on behalf of his record,
Mm-hmm.
and he has to defend his record.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And other than that, it's a personality race.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the fact that we have one-party politics contributed to personality type
No, sir.
races?
It had nothing to do with it.
You don't think so?
No, sir. We were as tough on each other, Democrat on Democrat,
Mm-hmm.
much tougher than we are today,
Uh-huh.
Republican on Democrat.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. So you're suggesting that issues never really are that big in an election?
On a local level?
Mm-hmm.
No, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Personality.
Mm-hmm.
And who can deliver the goods and who can't deliver the goods.
Mm-hmm.
And just how good are you?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
the
Uh-huh.
basis for an independent voter's
Uh-huh.
thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Why is he going to vote for you?
Uh-huh.
Because you're good.
Uh-huh.
Because you can
Yeah.
deliver.
Uh-huh. I knew that in recent years you'd run your campaigns in that way, and emphasizing your seniority and so on, and the ability to do things for Cobb County. Are you saying that this is the way you really always campaigned, that I can deliver the goods better than Ed Kendrick, or?
Well, we didn't run then because I didn't have any record.
Mm-hmm.
It was just pure personality.
Mm-hmm. That you just got.
And I could go out in the county and line up to folks that
Uh-huh.
won elections,
Uh-huh.
and he couldn't.
Uh-huh.
It'd be awfully hard to go to an old Paul in
Uh-huh.
a district,
Mhm.
district as they
Uh-huh.
call them,
Uh-huh.
and a schoolman talked to the old Paul.
Uh-huh. Didn't have anything in common.
Well, no,
Mhm.
he's done out of school.
Mm-hmm.
All of his kids is out of school.
Mm-hmm.
He done established himself as a leader in the community by being the
Mm-hmm.
justice of the peace
Mm-hmm.
or a local leader for some reason or another.
Mm-hmm.
And really and truly,
Mhm.
he don't have a great deal. In those days, he didn't have a
Mhm.
great deal of interest in education.
Mm-hmm. Were there a handful of strategic people around the county?
Absolutely.
Uh-huh.
If you back in those days, we could go to every militia district,
Uh-huh.
and if we could line up certain supports,
Mm-hmm.
we'd come to town and forget about the election.
Mm-hmm.
It was all over.
Mm-hmm. They just said
until
the
we
word
had
and
till we counted the scorecard.
they just said the word and the voters took their advice. Is that
That's
the way
correct. That's exactly correct.
it was?
Different leaders had different constituencies,
Mm-hmm.
and they listened to different people. And you go line up everybody's wheels
Yeah.
and come back to town.
Uh-huh. Who were some of these people that carried weight in your district?
Well, for example, the Loving Goods in Lost Mountain District,
Uh-huh.
Luke Sanford and his family in Lost Mountain District runs Lost Mountain Store,
Uh-huh.
a collecting point for everybody in those days,
Mm-hmm.
collecting point for a lot of people today.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you can go on that all around the county because we ran countywide.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Gus McPherson out in East Cobb,
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Felton Barnes in South Cobb,
Mm-hmm. Is that related to Roy Barnes?
Roy's uncle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we had them everywhere. Then you'd come back to Marietta and then you'd scrap over Marietta.
Uh-huh.
And for long, if you was a pretty good fella and had Glenn Reed, Red Aston, all them folks helping you,
Mm-hmm.
you could carry Marietta pretty good,
Mm-hmm.
which was my case.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Then when Red ran, I helped him.
Yeah.
And we made a representative out of him. We made a mayor out of him. I was his campaign manager when he ran for mayor.
Is that right?
Yeah. In the sense that you had a campaign manager.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
I would say I was more of an advisor than I was.
Uh-huh.
I was a strategy man.
I see.
And who was going to line up how and who and why.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah. So it's not the routine day-to-day running of a campaign so much as...
Yeah, you mean getting out brochures and all that stuff?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
We do that today. We didn't do that back then.
Mm-hmm.
It was mouth to mouth.
Mm-hmm. You had a smaller county at that time.
Sure.
Could do it that way.
Yeah. Organize the whole county in 2 weeks.
Well, now, 1960, when you would have gone to the legislature, is really an exciting time, I think, in Georgia political history, in that you got the integration of the schools beginning to take place at that time in 1961, and the Sibley Commission, and was all that taking place while you were in
I believe some of that had already taken
Uh-huh.
place before I got there. And
Uh-huh.
the demise of the county unit system was probably the biggest thing in my early political
Uh-huh.
career.
Could you say a few words about that?
About the demise or
Uh-huh.
about the county unit system?
Well, about how it came to an end.
What it came about is an end of the court ruling of one man, one vote.
Uh-huh.
When the courts decided that you
Yeah.
couldn't weigh votes anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Every man's vote had to count the same.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
That was the decision that broke the back of the county unit
Uh-huh.
system.
Uh-huh.
Did I welcome it? As an urban man, yeah, I welcomed it.
Uh-huh. So you were happy when that federal decision, of course I guess you had was it Baker versus Carr? Was
Yeah.
that? And then following that, there was, what was it, Gray versus Sanders, or Sanders versus Gray, something like
Well,
that?
that was that mayor of Albany, Jim Gray,
Uh-huh.
against Carl Sanders.
Uh-huh.
And he sued Carl, trying to uphold the county unit system, as I remember.
Mm-hmm.
And the county unit system was struck down.
Mm-hmm. Now why was he suing Carl Sanders?
Because he was governor.
Okay, so it comes after Sanders is governor.
That's 64, something, 62, 63,
62, I believe.
64.
I was
In
thinking
fact, in
64.
64, I recall going to Carl Sanders and getting the first $1.5 million
Uh-huh.
out of state government to build Cobb General Hospital.
Is that right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm the father of Cobb General.
I see. Did you support Sanders in the election of 1962 when he was running for governor?
I don't remember. I don't remember who he was running against.
Well, he's running against Marvin Griffin.
Oh, I supported Marvin Griffin.
Did you?
Yes, sir. The old wool hat crowd in Cobb County,
Mm-hmm.
which is of a few I've named for you.
Mm-hmm.
We called ourselves Wool Hat Boys.
Is that right?
We supported Marvin Griffin.
Uh-huh. Had you supported the Talmadges earlier?
Never voted for but one Talmadge in my life.
That's Herman?
I voted for Herman when he ran against Mattingly.
Uh-huh, in 1980.
And I did that at the request of a good personal friend I have over here, Mr. Sims Garrett.
Mm-hmm.
I never voted for a Talmadge.
Is that right?
No, sir.
Huh. But you were a wool hat boy.
In the sense that I had to wear that label
Uh-huh.
to get elected myself.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Well, that seems a little bit of a discrepancy in a way. I wonder if you could explain why you didn't support the Talmadges and yet you would have supported Marvin Griffin.
My friends were supporting Marvin Griffin. I supported my friends.
Uh-huh.
Had I not supported Marvin Griffin, my friends would have left me.
Uh-huh.
I was loyal to my friends.
I see.
I was not loyal to Marvin Griffin.
So you didn't care what they stood for or anything. It's just a local politics, really.
Where my friends went was where I was going.
Well,
I've supported a lot of devils.
Uh-huh. But your friends didn't support Herman Talmadge?
Some of them did. That's before I was in politics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He was a senator when
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I voted against his daddy the first vote I ever took.
Is that right?
I was a student at Tech,
Uh-huh.
and Ellis Arnold was running against the old man,
Mm-hmm.
and they were preaching all over the campus that Gene Talmadge was trying to destroy the university system of Georgia.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And I came home, and my mom and daddy did, but they never had voted.
Mm-hmm.
I shouldn't say that. They have voted, because I remember them talking about going to vote against that Al Smith.
Uh-huh.
And they voted for Ellis Arnold against Gene Talmadge
Uh-huh.
over the objection of some of my daddy's closest friends.
Is that right? Mm-hmm. Well, it would have been a critical issue to you, I guess, if you were at Georgia Tech at that time, because the system had lost its accreditation.
Well, I didn't know beans about it,
Uh-huh.
but I listened to the propaganda, and what propaganda was coming down on my side that I admired was, we're going to stop this fella from losing our accreditation.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to throw that rascal out of office,
Uh-huh.
and some of us good guys is going to take over.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And did I understand that all? Nah. I doubt seriously if any man ever understands every side of every issue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or maybe he'll understand it the way he wants to understand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You sound sort of like maybe you regretted your vote for Ellis Arnold later on. Did you?
No, never had any regrets. I considered him a very progressive man, although I frankly didn't appreciate that book of his, the shore dimly seen, when he was criticizing his own crowd.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Criticize somebody else, but don't criticize yourself unless it be criticism to make things better, not just for the sake of criticism.
Mm-hmm. I've heard before that book really ruined any future political career he might have had.
Well, I would say this, that I wasn't probably by myself when I having had been a supporter of his, didn't appreciate what he had to say in the book. The book would probably been better never being said, never having been written. Ellis would probably been better off too.
Yeah, okay. Well, 1960, then you were elected to the legislature, and the county unit system was going out about the
Going out
second
about
term.
64, I believe it was 62,
Yeah,
somewhere along.
somewhere in there. And so as an urban politician, it's really going to mean more seats in Cobb County then, I gather.
We went through in 64, we had a reapportionment.
Mm-hmm.
I lost my seat by default in 64 and got it back in either 64 or 65.
Mm-hmm.
The fellow that I beat only served 40 days.
Is that
He
right?
served.
Let's talk a bit about the election of 1964 when Cobb County had just gone to the five-man commission system. Now, I understand that you were a candidate for the full-time commissioner in that race?
I was a candidate for chairman after I had written the bill.
Uh-huh. Oh, you wrote the bill in the legislature.
Yes, sir.
And so, obviously, you were a strong supporter. Why were you in favor of going from the old one-man commission system to the five?
Well, I thought that the county had grown so much in population and had such a land area that the people would be better representative if they had more direct representation. And there were certain flaws in a one-man or an advisory board like we had back in those days. It was subject to a little more hanky-panky than five, the manipulation of 5 members. And for those reasons, I was always for a little bit broader representation. In fact, even today, I wish that I share with Senator Barnes the desire to have even broader than a 5-man representation. But I was a little bit ahead of my time. I proposed a county manager form of government for the county, a professional manager. It took 20-something years later before we ever got a county manager. And it took really the passage of the Barrett years. And I could never pass the county manager bill myself, but I figured out a way to do it, and I did it. And it was to get Mr. Johnny Isaacson to support it. And if Mr. Isaacson supported it between the Barrett year and the Earl Smith year, then Mr. Otis Brumby and his group, who had historically opposed the county managership under Mr. Barrett, they would support it if Mr. Isaacson supported it.
Is that right?
So I let Mr. Isaacson propose it as if it were his idea, and I tagged along.
I see. So, well, back in 1964, as I understand, there was a 5-man race for the county commissioner, and of course, Ernest Barrett, who ultimately won the race, was going to be the commissioner for the next 20 years.
17, 20, somewhere along in there. I forget how many.
But you were a candidate, and who else was in that race?
Well, Mr. O.C. Hubert was a candidate. He and Mr. Bill Teague ran as a team. Mr. Barrett ran with a gentleman by the name of Mr. Bob Austin. You had to select a deputy. I ran with Mr. Arthur Bacon, who was later mayor of Smyrna. Dr. Jack Henderson ran with, well, I've forgotten who. That's the only time in politics that I've ever had what I called, well, I want a nice, sweet word to say to you, but that means the same thing. I got cheated, would be or rooked, or tricked, however you want to call it, in politics, to the extent that I almost, made me ashamed of my own abilities.
Well, what happened?
Well, we had a voting machine, which was called a Shoop voting machine, which was supposed to be used as an Australian ballot, which meant vertical. Candidates, if you had an A, B, C, D, they were all lined up under each other on the front line. The clerk of the court, who was in charge of elections at that time, rigged the machines where they went vertically. And a fellow with Wilson way out there in right field.
Way out to the far end, you're saying?
Didn't have a chance.
So
every candidate, with the exception of one, in that election in '64, whose name was first on, in other words, it was an A, B, C, or whatever, was first on the ballot, won. Because the people didn't know how to use voting machines. First of all, they used a paper ballot up.
So this is not like the voting machines we've got today. It's those things where you pull the little lever. Is that?
This was an old Shoop lever machine where you went out.
Yeah, I remember.
And you pushed the lever to one side, which was clockwise. Well, the problem with being out there, especially Mr. Henderson, whom I considered to be the winner of the campaign, the problem with Mr. Henderson was people got confused as to whether they pulled a lever that was right in front of his name to vote for him, or pulled the one right back of his name to vote for him.
Yeah. So Barrett and then Henderson was the second name on the ballots. That's the way it worked.
Well, where did
let's see
where did O.C. Hubert come?
Well, let's see.
E, F, G.
Well, Hubert would be after Henderson.
Yeah.
So So what you're saying is a lot of people.
Well, there's somebody else in there now that come before Henderson, and I can't think of who the candidates were.
Well, I had Hubert, Henderson, Teague, Wilson, and Barrett.
Barrett was first. Seemed like there was another.
Was it? Well, maybe.
But anyhow, Henderson, you couldn't tell where you was going to vote for him with the lever in front of his name and the lever back of his name. But there wasn't no damn doubt about Barrett.
Yeah. So at any rate, Barrett may have gotten some votes that were really meant for the next guy on the.
Well, I made the statement that that's the only time I ever got done in.
So if you could have changed your
I ain't
name,
been done in since then.
So if you could have changed your name to something that started with an A,
Hey, I'd been the winner.
been all right.
Or if I'd have been bucking the odds.
Now,
Because every candidate on the front line, with exception of one, came in first.
how did you change that so that it wouldn't happen that way again?
They changed machines.
So now
We never used that machine again.
So now they just have them in a line going down the page.
Well, we have what the politicians in a slang language call a Ouija board, punch board.
Yeah.
Punch a computer card.
Yeah.
We call them Ouija boards.
I see. Well, okay, so you got beat in that race, and I gather from what you're saying that it
Reapportionment came about that same year.
Okay, so that created a new seat.
Created another election. And I
see.
ran for the same seat I had.
I see.
But I ran against a guy that was holding.
Now, who was that?
Judge Vernon Duncan. He wasn't a judge then. He was just a lawyer, Vernon Duncan, and a good guy as ever lived.
So you ran and defeated Vernon Duncan then?
I ran for re-election.
Almost.
I still had my old signs.
Is that right? Yeah.
Re-elect Joe Mack Wilson.
Well, did you miss one legislative session as a result?
That's the reason I'm 27 instead of 28.
I see.
Me and Mr. Murphy walked in the door at the same time.
I see. But Tom
But
Murphy's,
he's got 28 years seniority and I only have 27.
So you both were elected originally in 1960 then?
That's correct. And seated in January '61.
Yeah. Okay, so you beat Vernon Duncan in 65
or 65,
whatever,
somewhere
and went
along.
back to the legislature the following year, and then right about that time would be the period where you have where Lester Maddox would be running for governor. Then I guess in '66.
Yeah.
Wasn't it?
Yeah. He ran against this fellow. The Republicans all voted for Lester Maddox, thinking he would be easier to beat than any other Democrat against Callaway. Well, their trick, which there's a lot of rumor they're going to use that same trick in Wisconsin next week.
Is that right?
And the trick backfired on them. They got an arch conservative a Democrat to run against a kind of a liberal, prissy type of Republican. And Lester was the majority winner only when you subtracted the vote of Ellis Arnold out of it, who was a write-in. That threw it in the legislature. And when it got to the legislature, I voted for Lester Maddox for two reasons. He's a Democrat, and he had carried the Western District of Cobb County, which I represented.
I see.
But I made the statement at the time, had Bo Callaway carried my district, I would have bucked the trend, and I would have voted for Bo Callaway because I think the people's opinion, the majority ought to rule.
Yeah. In the Democratic primary in '66, did you take a side in that race when you had?
Fighting for my own life, I didn't.
So you didn't worry about any of the
I
candidates
just
for
worrying
governor?
about myself. Oh, I don't say I didn't vote for one or the other, but you never would get me to say it.
Yeah.
I was wanting both sides, personally.
I see. Now, that election in '66, where the legislature ended up making the choice, is considered by a lot of people very pivotal in Georgia politics in terms of the relative power of governors versus legislatures.
That was the pivotal year, and in my lifetime, there have been about three items that were paramount.
Mm-hmm.
And the first, of course, is the one man, one vote.
Mm-hmm.
The second was the election of Lester Maddox,
Uh-huh.
and the ascension of power
Mm-hmm.
by the legislature, the House and the Senate themselves,
Mm-hmm.
and mainly by the House.
Mm-hmm. Could you explain a little bit about how that happened in '66?
Well, I think the leadership of the House at that time, which was Swainsboro George Smith, was the Speaker,
Mm-hmm.
grasped the idea that Lester didn't know too much about state government,
Mm-hmm.
and that they better walk into the vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
And so they did.
Mm-hmm.
They declared themselves independent of the governor's office
Yeah.
as far as budgetary matters were concerned,
Mm-hmm.
and all other matters.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, they'd be an independent body from that day forward.
Yeah.
And they have been.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
In fact, the House has become the most powerful of all legislative bodies in the history of the state of Georgia. The present House is the most powerful by the very nature of it.
Did Lester Maddox support this kind of change, or was
No,
he even
sir,
aware?
he
that
didn't
it
know what
happened?
was happening to him.
Uh-huh.
And he had some pretty good advisors, among them being Tom Murphy. Tom Murphy was Lester Maddox's floor leader.
I see. Uh-huh.
But
Mhm.
that crowd of George Smith and them, they didn't mind beating Murphy.
Mm-hmm.
Murphy wasn't nothing then. He just a little old boy from, like me, he was a little old boy from Harrelson County.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Then when Smith died, of course, Murphy took over.
Mm-hmm.
We elected Murphy.
What year was that?
I don't remember.
But Murphy, you
It
remember?
was the end of the Maddox year, and
About-
who comes in next?
Well,
After?
Jimmy Carter comes next after Maddox.
They all,
So-
Smith was there when Carter was there.
So this is a race about 1970 then, when Murphy, and was that when he beat Elliot Levitas out for Speaker?
I think we put Elliott up, and when I say we, I'm talking about, I formed what we call the Urban Caucus in 1970,
Uh-huh.
and which was a collection of urban legislators.
Mm-hmm.
And what we were trying to do is get our fair share
Mm-hmm.
of state
Mm-hmm.
government, power, and
Mhm.
money, and whatever
Mm-hmm.
for our individual districts. That had come after reapportionment, you remember, and it increased our numbers,
Yeah.
but it hadn't increased our power,
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
and still hadn't.
Uh-huh. The rural areas still dominate. as
Still
well.
dominate today.
Mm-hmm. And you're the one that put together the Urban Caucus?
Yes, in 1970.
Uh-huh.
One of the first person I called was Elliot Levitas.
Is that right?
Yes, sir.
So this, of course, all of the Atlanta area was in the Urban Caucus?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
One of my members was Sam Nunn.
Is that right?
He's one of my students.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Huh. And so, so what you're saying, the Urban Caucus, urban areas from all over the state, as opposed to the rural
That's correct.
parts of the state. And so you all backed Elliot Levitas, but Levitas was defeated by Tom Murphy in
That's
that
correct.
race.
That's
Mhm.
correct.
It seems to me there was an earlier.
There was a race I don't believe you got that timing exactly right.
Well,
I
I
believe
may not.
Tom Murphy was running for Speaker Pro Tem.
I believe you're right on that. And so that was, he beat Elliot Levitas
That's
for
correct.
Speaker Pro Tem
That's correct.
in '70. And so it's,
Then we Urban Caucus boys learned to love Murphy shortly thereafter
is that right?
when he became Speaker.
Just because he became Speaker, you had to work with him? Is that what you're suggesting?
No, Murphy's smart. He'd get together with you and he'd say, "What's the matter? What do you guys think y'all have to organize an urban caucus for?"
Mm-hmm.
Well, boss, we ain't got no power. We don't have any committees. All you country boys hold all the committee chairmanships and all the vice chairmans
Mhm.
and secretaries.
Mm-hmm.
All we do is get to vote.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to organize and get organized even better,
Mm-hmm.
unless that system ceases.
Yeah.
Well, Murphy being a smart man like he is, he just appointed all of us committee chairmen.
Is that right?
All the leaders of the urban caucus.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
He named committee chairman.
Uh-huh. So he won you over with that then?
Well, I believe a better word is he took us over.
So that was part of his attempt to entrench himself in power.
It did.
That did it.
Yeah. That put us and them together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He took the lead. He skimmed the leadership off of urban caucus
Uh-huh.
and left a skeleton hanging out there.
Uh-huh. Hmm.
Pretty good strategy if I'd ever.
Yeah.
Selfishly, what did we end up with? We ended up a guy like me being a committee chairman.
Mm-hmm.
We ended up with Elliot Revelis as committee chairman.
Mm-hmm.
Just on and on and on. The truth of it was, we got more power out of Tom Murphy than anybody in the history of the state of Georgia ever got before.
Hmm.
From these areas.
Yeah.
They didn't ever have, on the county unit days, didn't have to pay no attention to anybody from the urban area.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the only one they ever paid any attention to was one of them, was Harold Willingham.
Yeah. Uh-huh. What was the role of George Busby in the legislature in those days?
Well, he was majority leader when under Smith.
Uh-huh.
And when he came there from Albany, little old young, fresh-faced lawyer,
Mm-hmm.
pretty nice fella, medium ability.
Mm-hmm. Did you support him when he got elected majority leader?
I don't remember.
I believe
It wasn't
he,
really important to him.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
He wasn't going to share none of his power no how.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Busby never was a sharer of power.
Is that right?
He took it all upon himself.
Mm-hmm.
If there's any loose laying around there, he gathered that in too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What committee did Tom Murphy make you the chair of?
Reapportionment, which suited me just fine.
Mm-hmm. So you got to do the reapportionment from the 1970 census then? Or was this after that already been done?
It's already been done.
So
I was on reapportionment.
Uh-huh. So the one that was really important to you then would be the reapportionment that came after the 1980 census. And
That's correct.
that would you say a few words about those? If you were on it in 1970, were there a lot of changes made as a result of the reapportionment in 1970?
Yeah, a lot of changes. One man, one vote.
Uh-huh.
And then they had a census count, of course, and then you responded to that census count by allocating representatives according to population.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there was a great change.
Mm-hmm. How did it affect the Atlanta area when those changes took place?
The same way it affects it today, very poorly.
Mm-hmm.
We're divided up 3 different ways now, and we weren't divided up but 2 ways back in the days you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
We were divided up somewhat along racial lines.
Mm-hmm.
Blacks wanting to go their thing, do their thing, and the whites, suburbanites wanting to do their thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then was injected in later years, and as of today, the Republicans, and they want to do their thing.
Mm-hmm.
As a result of those 3 factions
Mm-hmm.
and their inability to get together,
Mm-hmm.
reapportionment hadn't done a thing for urban areas in the state of Georgia.
Mm-hmm. Because of the division in those 3 groups?
Well, I was told this week, for example, by a department head, he was going to pass a bill dealing with a certain matter,
Mm-hmm.
and it was going to have a complete rural flavor to it.
Mm-hmm.
I suggested to him that maybe we in the urban areas might have something to say about that, and he just laughed me off and says, "They're together.
Hmm.
You ain't,"
Hmm.
which is a lot of truth in there.
Mm-hmm. Following the 1980 census, when you were head of the reapportionment committee, I know that was a very controversial reapportionment in that year, and I wonder if you would kind of tell us your side of what went on in that.
Well, the only controversy, the legislative reapportionment went like clockwork, and I was highly commended for that.
Commended by
Murphy, who was my
Murphy.
boss,
Mm-hmm.
and to everyone else associated with it. The controversy came in the creation of the district in Atlanta.
The 5th congressional district.
Yes, and it came over the ratio of whites to blacks and other things. And after a trip to the Justice Department in 1980, 81, somewhere along there, I was told what the law was by the Justice Department.
Yeah.
We came back and patterned an act identical to what we had told to do. We raised the black participation in that Atlanta district from 48% up to 58%. And that was the first plan that I drew, and that had I signed off on. Well, the blacks wanted 60, and to get 60, they had to go down in southwest DeKalb and pick up a few preponderantly black districts, which was all right with me. That gave them a little bit above 60%. That was satisfactory with me. Because I still felt like Elliot Levitas could get reelected in DeKalb County, and that whomever they wanted to elect in Fulton County wasn't none of my business no how.
Yeah. So
whichever one they wanted elected was their business.
So that's the way the plan was written?
No.
Okay, so that came, so the way you wrote the plan, it was 58% black.
That's correct. That's the Wilson plan.
And then after that plan went through,
the blacks wanted 60.
Okay, so they
anything that busted 60 was satisfactory to Al Scott and to the black caucus.
So they took that to the courts then? Is that
they took 58 to court.
Yeah, that's right. That's what I mean. But they went to court on.
I tried to get a settlement between the leadership of the House and the black caucus. I failed.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
I was told this, and we're going to beat them. Being they're going to beat the black caucus.
Who was saying that?
The leadership of the House.
So Tom Murphy and others.
And from that, of course, I'm hired out. I've done my 58, which meets the letter of the law in every respect that you can. I don't care. The man that wrote the act, the federal act, would have to say that 58% from 48% is not a diminishing.
Yeah, I think the law says something about the intent to dilute black voting strength.
You can't dilute when you're putting all of them together. You can, I think. What they actually did end up, the court declared 65%,
so,
which is what the makeup of the district is today. Plus, it was gaining at a rate of 2% per year.
So let me see if I've got this straight.
Okay.
It was 48% black.
That's where I found it.
You, after talking to the Justice Department, thought that they would be happy with 58%.
I thought 58% met the letter of the law.
Okay, so after you did that, the Black Caucus then wanted to increase it to over 60%.
Anything that busted 60.
By bringing in Southwest DeKalb. But you're saying that you had no problem with that. You tried to persuade the leadership to go along with that, but the leadership wanted to break the Black Caucus, and so
no, there was never any mention of breaking the Black Caucus. But the thing was that what I was told, I've got this plan that Mr. Al Scott from Savannah and I have devised, mostly Mr. Scott now. He has devised what we call a Scott plan, which takes in part of Southwest DeKalb and makes the entire district a little bit above 60%, which suits them being the Black Caucus just fine.
Okay.
So rather than give the 2 points, the leadership told me, just let them win it in court.
I see. So what do you do at that point?
I ain't got no choice.
So you oppose this increase to 60% at that point?
No, I never said anymore.
Okay, you just stay quiet then, and it gets...
I get carried to court.
I see, okay. So then it goes to court, and when it goes to the federal court, which I believe was up in Washington, D.C.
District Court, Washington.
Why was it that particular court, by the way?
That's where the law says all of them have to go.
Oh, it does?
They don't try them in the district court
Uh-huh.
like Atlanta because
Uh-huh.
they think maybe you'd have regional
Mm-hmm.
prejudices.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay. So it goes to that court then, and the court it's the court that decides that it's going to be increased to 65%.
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
But now, as a side from all of that, and what became the real issue,
Mm-hmm.
is what I had said in 1976 that was interpreted, and probably correctly so, as a racial slur.
Mm-hmm.
In 1976, I told this lady from North Fulton, Miss Dorothy Felton,
Mm-hmm.
not in 1980,
Mm-hmm.
as she said,
Mhm.
as she testified.
Mm-hmm.
She told a lie about that.
Mm-hmm.
I said to her, she came over to my desk one day whining about how the blacks in the Fulton County delegation mistreated her,
Mm-hmm.
that they embarrassed her and they laughingly beat her down and wouldn't let her have her way of anything.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
she, in jest,
Mm-hmm.
kind of sort of in jest,
Mhm.
told me, Joe, why don't you take us over into Cobb County?
Mm-hmm.
And I was sitting at my desk and I looked up at her over my shoulder, and she's a Republican from
Mhm.
North Fulton, a
Mhm.
dandy little country club type, you know.
Yeah.
And I says to her, Dorothy, there's some things worse than niggers, and one of them's Republicans. And
so that's,
that became the racial slur.
uh-huh.
I didn't intend it to defame any
Uh-huh.
racial group.
Uh-huh.
It was just an off-the-cuff
Mm-hmm.
remark
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
would probably have been better suited to my daddy's era
Mm-hmm.
at my age and the civilization and
Yeah.
the society of
Uh-huh.
his time than mine.
So it's a comment.
It was a bad, blundering, blustery era.
So it's
And did
something
I say it? Yes, I said it.
Mhm.
But I said it in 1976 and not 19 in the content of any reapportionment.
Mm-hmm.
But it became the issue
Mm-hmm.
as to what I had said,
Uh-huh.
not the plan.
Uh-huh.
The plan never was even discussed. It was where you are you or are you not a racist, Mr. Wilson?
So the comment becomes relevant in that it might show intent. They're arguing.
Have 58% district plan
Mm-hmm.
might have been devised by a racist.
Uh-huh.
Well, I vehemently deny that I'm any racist. Ain't nobody except her.
Mm-hmm.
And some of her ilk have said I was a racist. You won't get that lady to say I'm a racist.
Uh-huh.
You won't get nobody in Marietta to say I'm a racist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I don't deny using the word.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
So
it got where it wasn't the Atlanta Journal, the Constitution, not particularly the local paper,
Mhm.
but that was the issue.
uh-huh.
Was
you-
the plan written by a racist?
So you're suggesting that that was not in any way typical of what you ordinarily said. You know, it's a one-time comment. Is that?
Well, I don't say that Southerners, white Southerners, don't use that term,
Mm-hmm.
and still do, probably.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly don't.
Mm-hmm.
I learned my lesson.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. You think it's better for politicians not to make jokes, maybe?
Well, certainly more discreet
Mm-hmm.
type of jokes.
Mhm.
Certainly not of a racial nature.
Mm-hmm.
Or even in answer to one of those snobbish type Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
And I was genuine in my what I felt about
Mm-hmm.
in Cobb County. I would have much preferred a good, big, large segment of blacks
Mm-hmm.
than I would a great, big, large segment of East Cobb Republicans
Mm-hmm.
or Sandy Springs Republicans. Let me straighten that out.
Uh-huh.
She was from Sandy
Yeah.
Springs.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Is
Would I
it-
prefer one over the other? You give me my choice, and I'll take the good, nice, clean, upstanding, upright blacks every time
Mhm.
over a good crowd of snobbish country club type East Cobb, North Fulton Republican.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll take.
Mm-hmm. As I recall, in that court case, you weren't alone in your point of view that Governor Busby and Weisfowler and others were arguing in behalf of what the legislature did as well.
On behalf of the 58%
Of the
plan?
58% plan.
There's nothing wrong with the 58% plan.
Um,
It met every letter of the law.
I remember at that time and reading about it in the newspaper, kind of having the feeling as though, I want to get your reaction to this, that perhaps the typical politicians, typical leadership, I should say, in Georgia, and their worldview and that of that court were almost as if perhaps you'd come from different planets, that, you know, that maybe you're...
You mean our society versus that society in Washington?
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm trying to say, is that it just seemed to me at the time as though, you know, that no matter what you all said, that you really weren't talking to each other in a way.
The courts and us.
Mm-hmm.
You're absolutely right, and what the court did, in my judgment, is use the excuse of a fellow having made a racial remark. Well, they used the excuse of the racial remark to raise the percentage in the black district from 58% to 65% plus. And part of their rationale was, and it's this, and if you will find me any reference to this in any of the Civil Rights or Voting Rights Act, then I stand corrected. They said that blacks did not register in the same ratio as whites, and therefore they needed more numbers to make up for the lack of registration. A further stipulation was that they did not vote once they were registered in the same ratio as whites did, and they needed a higher percentage to ensure that a black man would get elected. Well, you and no one else can show me in any of those voting rights or civil rights acts where they take into account the lack of registration or the lack of participation after one is registered. They use that as an excuse, and of course that's the case law today, is that you've got to take those two things into account. That's legislating by court edict.
Could the state of Georgia have appealed that federal court decision?
Oh yes, they could appeal, but they had no heart to, and
Didn't think
it had gotten out of hand in that it wasn't a judicial decision anymore. It was a decision that by the way, all those court appointees were appointed by either Jimmy Carter or, Lyndon Johnson. Two blacks and one white lady.
So after that decision, then the legislature had to go into special session
And reapportion.
basically do what the court said to do.
Did identically what to report. And the only thing that they did, they created Pat Swindell, and they defeated Elliott Levitas, who was considered, in Washington at least, and in his home district, a good legislator.
By taking relatively
Took
liberal...
all of Levitas's voters away from him and put Swindell voters out of North Fulton in with DeKalb County. And Swindell is the result. Well, how did that help the black representation in the Georgia House of Representatives, state, government house? Every vote that John Lewis takes, Swindell cancels him out. So it's a wash. So really and truly, the Black Caucus is responsible for Pat Swindell.
It's an interesting point.
Well, I had one last little gig. This fellow Paul Coverdale, who was senator and still senator, he and Julian Bond were the daddies of this district by way of Al Scott. They were the daddies. They were the mother and the daddy of it. And what they did, one of them was going to be a U.S. congressman from the 5th district, and one of them's going to be the U.S. congressman from the 4th district.
I see.
Well, it's one of my past. I'm out of the scene now. They done it for all purposes, stripped me of my chairmanship. I did manage that them two fellas would be in the same congressional district. So
that,
they'll have to run against each other if they want to be
so
congressmen.
that was your last,
That was my parting shot.
your parting shot. Well, I don't believe either one of them are going to make it.
Well, neither one of them made it so far.
Yeah.
Although that little Cloverdale boy,
Yeah.
he may could move someday
Mhm.
and be a new Pat Swindell, because I believe they're going to need a new Pat Swindell.
You think that with all the scandal connected with him?
Well, I saw Mr. Swindell on television last night on the McNeil Lara
I saw
defending
that too.
Mr. Ed Meese.
Mhm.
And so I asked myself the question, why did they have to go to the bottom of the barrel to get somebody in the House to defend Mr. Meese?
Mhm.
Then it occurred to me, well, I'll be dog. Mr. Meese's crowd, by way of Mr. Barr, U.S. District Attorney in Atlanta, is investigating Mr. Swindell.
Huh.
And maybe Mr. Swindell will get some goody points out of this with Mr. Meese
Uh-huh.
and Mr. Barr
Uh-huh.
for coming on television and defending Mr. Meese.
I see. That's an interesting theory.
Maybe more in theory, son.
Well, let's go back to some of the other things that you were involved in the legislature, if you don't mind.
Surely.
You were on the Rules Committee, I believe. I guess you still are, for a good many years as well. Is that correct?
Yes, still am.
And
Rules is considered a very, very important committee. And only the select get on rules.
Now, when did it come about that you were on the Rules Committee? Was that
After Murphy became Speaker?
Mm-hmm. And so almost immediately after
No,
that?
sir. No, sir. I had to prove myself,
Uh-huh.
which I did.
Mm-hmm.
I went through the war when I went through that reapportionment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mr. Murphy did something during reapportionment that he's never done before or since. And I'm going to tell you this story.
Okay.
And I don't know that I ever wanted to become, absolute republic, although
Well,
he would not deny it.
Let
No,
me
you don't
just
need to-
remind you.
No,
Okay.
don't shut it off. We got it on. Mr. Murphy came to me during reapportionment after I had done what he called a masterful job on especially Georgia House reapportionment.
mm-hmm.
Reapportionment for the Georgia House.
Uh-huh.
I hadn't made too many folks mad,
Mm-hmm.
and I had done the job, and I had met the letter of the law, and he
Uh-huh.
thought I had done a good job.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where he asked me to do something that he never done before, nor since. He learned a lesson right here,
Mhm.
Mr. Murphy.
Mm-hmm.
He asked me, would I take the chairmanship of appropriations?
Mm-hmm.
Now, he asked me. I did not ask for it. He asked me.
Mm-hmm.
I told him to give me a day to think about it, and I let him know. And I did. And he says, well, it's yours. And then I got in trouble with the Justice Department on all this that we just gone over.
Sure.
As a political matter, he had to withdraw from my appointment.
Mm-hmm.
I understood that.
Mm-hmm.
I still understand it.
Yeah.
I only thought I wanted to be chairman of appropriations.
Mm-hmm.
What I really wanted to be, as I now realize, was chairman of Ways and Means.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
And later, when Ways and Means became open, by Marcus Collins going to the Department of Revenue,
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Murphy, in this instance, I asked him,
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to be chairman of Ways and Means. He appointed me chairman of Ways and
Mm-hmm.
Means. Ways and Means, among us, is considered the most important committee in the House, in either body of the
Mhm.
House of Representatives or the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important in this sense, as opposed to appropriations.
Yeah.
You can't appropriate what you ain't got.
Mm-hmm.
You got to get up the money before you can appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, those of us who think we know
Uh-huh.
consider Ways and Means the ultimate committee.
Uh-huh.
Because all appropriations bills,
Mm-hmm.
all tax revenue measures, not appropriations now, but all tax measures have to start in the House,
Mm-hmm.
and they have to start in the Ways and Means Committee.
Would you explain the tax factoring and the bill that was adopted this year?
This year?
Uh-huh.
Well, I consider factoring probably the most important thing that was, now you understand, factoring is a misnomer.
Mhm.
We eliminated factoring.
Mhm.
The bill eliminates factoring,
Mhm.
which is the process of applying an across-the-board percentage adjustment
Mhm.
to a local digest.
Mhm.
We eliminated that.
Mhm.
And within 42 months, every county in the state of Georgia will have to be at 40% evaluation, which is the state law.
Mhm.
All right, what is the impact of that as far as local governments is concerned?
Mhm.
Well, first of all, you're going to stop this unevenness and unfairness of factoring.
Mhm.
And then, what are you going to be able to do? Everybody, theoretically, under this bill, will be at 40% statewide.
Uh-huh.
Well, an application of the same identical millage that you're applying today versus the adjusted 40%, in other words, the new digest,
Uh-huh.
will raise, without raising one dime of taxes, millage-wise,
Mhm.
$300 million by 1992.
Is that right? Mhm.
Yes, sir. It's the most important thing that's happened to local government
Uh-huh.
in my lifetime
Mhm.
as chairman of the Ways and Means.
Mhm. So in effect, it's better than a tax increase.
Well, it is a tax increase, but it's a fair tax increase in that everybody's property will be in Podunk, Georgia, or
Mhm.
Marietta, Georgia, or Cobb County, Georgia,
Mhm.
will be on the same footing and on the same basis,
Mhm.
40%
Mhm.
of its
Mhm.
actual work.
Mhm. Mhm. So if I understand that correctly, then that means that all counties are going to have to make sure that if they haven't reassessed somebody's property for the last 30 years or whatever, they're going to have to bring it up to that 40%.
The law says they have to bring it up to 40%,
Mhm.
and then the law provides a penalty.
Mhm.
And the penalty is if you don't do it, which is that's your prerogative,
Uh-huh.
Mr. County,
Mhm.
you can't draw down any state
Mhm.
transportation dollars.
Mhm.
Cuts off your road money.
Uh-huh.
That's the penalty.
Uh-huh.
I think most counties are going to want to conform,
Mhm.
which is what the law says they should be doing in the first place.
Mhm.
So in that sense, we eliminated factoring.
Mhm.
We call it a factoring bill, but actually it's the elimination of factoring.
Do you consider this your most important accomplishment in terms of tax legislation?
No, sir. I consider the idea that I had, which is used by over half of Georgia today, and this is the idea. The idea was that we pass a local sales tax
Uh-huh.
for a short period of time to
Mhm.
solve local problems.
Mhm.
Now, I dreamed up the idea, but it was really Al Burris that passed the bill. It would not have passed without Al Burris
Mhm.
being majority leader of the House.
Mhm.
Al Burris was the technician. Al Burris was the driving force.
Mhm.
Al Burris put the votes together.
Mhm.
It was simply an idea that I had
Mhm.
that Al and I went together on, and I
Mhm.
consider that the most important thing that
Mhm.
I've ever had any
Mhm.
participation in.
Was this done primarily so that Cobb County could build its roads?
That's correct.
Mhm.
Well, that's what I had in mind when I dreamed up the idea.
Mhm.
I presented it to Al, and he had some skepticism about it to begin with. Then the more Al thought on it, the better he liked the idea.
Mhm.
Then with his drive and his knowledge and everything, which he had tremendous abilities.
Mhm.
People of this county just don't know about Al Burris.
Mhm.
He passed that bill.
Mhm.
He passed it. He got the governor to sign it the instant it passed the Senate.
Mhm.
Earl Smith came running home with the bill in his hand, a copy of it, and if you will recall, he called an election for roads
Mhm.
within a certain period of time.
Mhm. Mhm.
And, with credit to Earl Smith, he got out and explained it to the people
Uh-huh.
and told them what they're going to get for their money,
Uh-huh.
and it sold.
Mhm. Now, am I correct that there was a bill that passed this session that would provide for an extension of that local tax if the legislature should increase
General purpose
taxes,
sales tax.
statewide?
Well, I introduced a bill that would remove what they had put on the year before when I was in the hospital over at Emory.
Uh-huh.
They had tacked on an amendment to this Burris-Wilson bill.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we had called a sunset provision.
Mm-hmm.
That in the event that the state would up on its 3% tax to anything above 3% statewide,
Uh-huh.
then the local options, the Burris-Wilson bills, all went out of business
Mm-hmm.
at the expiration of the term
Mm-hmm.
which they had been voted in by the people.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to remove that sunset feature.
Mm-hmm.
The leadership of the House would not let me do that. They gave me this compromise.
Mm-hmm.
And the compromise is, if the state goes up any above 3%, let's say goes from 3 to 4,
Mm-hmm.
then I have 15 months to come back. Otherwise now, after that period, all of those bills sunset.
Mm-hmm.
You can't have a new one, in other words.
Yeah.
You can expire the ones that's in effect then,
Mm-hmm.
but you cannot have a new one
Mm-hmm.
unless I remove that sunset. I've got one more shot at removing the sunset.
It was the leadership behind the sunset bill?
The leadership passed the sunset bill when I told you while I was over in Emory in the hospital.
What was their motive?
Make you vote for a statewide sales tax.
Mm-hmm. In other words, that was something in the way of people in Cobb County wouldn't vote.
Well, the thought was among that leadership crowd down there that if you already had one, you'd be pretty happy and pretty sassy,
Yeah.
and that you wouldn't vote for theirs, but you want to continue your own.
Would you say that the year before last, when you were in the hospital, and of course Al Burris wasn't around anymore,
Al's gone,
was a
yeah.
bad year for Cobb County?
Well, I'll tell you how bad it was, Professor. In 1887,
Mm-hmm.
out of the state treasury for items of interest to Cobb County, we did not receive one red dime.
Mm.
This year, we didn't do as well as I wanted to do, but we got $10.5 million.
Mm-hmm.
Can you ever get a newspaper to say that? Nah.
The 10.5 million, of course, a big part of that went to
10 million
Kennesaw
went to
College.
your school, Kennesaw.
For the
Then
business.
500,000 was other items that I included into the budget.
Uh-huh.
One that I guess I'm most proud of is the $200,000 where we're going to start a Well Babies program at Kennestone Hospital. $200,000.
What is that all about?
Giving pregnant women prenatal, delivery, and postnatal services. Those that can't afford anything, and they show up at the back door of the hospital,
Yeah.
ready to have a baby right then. I'm proud of that.
Yeah. And that was your idea?
Well, I'm on the board of Kennestone
Uh-huh.
Hospital, and it's nothing new about
Uh-huh.
the program.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, we've done it for Grady for years because of that big impact of pregnant women showing up at the back door without any previous medical attention.
But your awareness of this grew out of your participation on the board at Kennestone?
No, I guess my awareness grew out of it dealing with Murphy and his interest in the same type of program over at Grady.
Would you tell your side of the story on the Southern Tech situation this year?
Where we lost the building?
Where they thought they were going to get a student center, and it was on the list, as I recall, high up on
Number
the
3 on the
list
priority list.
from the Board of Regents.
In fact, number 1 was Gainesville, and number 2 was your building at Kennesaw, and number 3 was the building at Southern Tech. Yeah.
What happened to that?
Well, what happened? Early in the session, I made a great deal of noise about my lack of support and my disinterest in there being tax money spent on stadiums. And of course, the one in the news was the Dome Stadium in Atlanta. I made too much noise about it. The leadership in the House took exceptions to what I was having to say about the Dome Stadium, and as a punishment, they took my building. I got Barnes to reinstate it in the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
And then Barnes took a beating in that two of the conferees on the House Conference Committee, which is between the House and the Senate
Mm-hmm.
on the budget,
Mm-hmm.
they're Barnes' rivals for the gubernatorial candidacy.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Walker from Houston County and Mr. Bubba McDonald from Jackson County.
Mm-hmm.
So they beat Mr. Barnes' efforts to put it back in.
Uh-huh.
And of course, we lost it because we
Mm-hmm.
mouthed too much about the Dome Stadium.
Mm-hmm.
But now, as a matter of public policy, I'm going to tell you, I'm still right. I don't give a darn what they say.
Mm-hmm.
That the state of Georgia does not need to be in any kind of stadium business.
Mm-hmm.
For example, how am I, as a state official, from this day forward, going to refuse somebody from Hayhira
Mm-hmm.
who comes to the Capitol and says, you give us 30%, we've got 70%, we want to build a football stadium.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mhm.
bad public policy.
Mm-hmm.
You ain't taking care of your educational needs, much less your playthings and play toys.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That was my opposition. It was not in direct opposition to the stadium dome as to giving Rankin Smith and that group. Although I kind of resent that,
Mm-hmm.
that was not the motivator.
Mm-hmm.
The motivator was, it's not good public policy at this time in our history
Mm-hmm.
to go into the stadium plaything business.
Mm-hmm.
We're not taking care of basic education.
Uh-huh. I understand your point of view on that. To what extent is there tension still between Cobb County and Atlanta? And did that play a role, the fact that Atlanta wanted to build the stadium?
No. The tension between whom?
I guess, legislators from Cobb County and Atlanta.
No, really and truly,
You don't
the
think?
Atlanta group of legislators had a hard time buying a dome stadium themselves. In fact,
Is that right?
they're still
Mhm.
split up about whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to pay for any of it,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't want to give up
Uh-huh.
the stadium they're already making payments on.
Uh-huh. So you're suggesting that we've overplayed the differences between Atlanta and the suburbs?
No, that hadn't been overplayed, and it's still a factor, although it's less and less a factor.
Mm-hmm.
And it gets to be this, back in the old days, greed being on their side,
Mm-hmm.
they wanted everything you had.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the ball is on the other side of the net now.
Mm-hmm.
The greed is out in the suburbs.
Mm-hmm.
That down in Atlanta today is a holler shell.
Uh-huh.
The banks are leaving,
Yeah.
the law firms are leaving, the
Mm-hmm.
people's done left.
Mm-hmm.
All you got down there left at 5 Points, which used to be the center of all commerce,
Mm-hmm.
culture, and everything else in the
Mhm.
South, it's done switched somewhere else.
Uh-huh.
And an awful lot of it switched outside of 285,
Mm-hmm.
and an awful lot of it, in particular, Cobb County.
Mm-hmm.
So what them that was,
Mm-hmm.
ain't no more.
Mm-hmm.
So you see radio stations coming up here,
Mm-hmm.
you see television stations coming up here and asking, what do y'all want?
Mm-hmm.
You see newspapers coming up here and opening up bureaus,
Mm-hmm.
which we're where it is now.
Mm-hmm.
It ain't 5 Points no more.
Uh-huh.
That's the main reason for the demise of any interest in Martyr
Mm-hmm.
in Cobb County. Everybody don't want to go to 5 Points no more.
Yeah.
And
Uh-huh.
who wants to get on a Martyr train and ride 5 Points?
Mm-hmm.
Ain't nothing there when you get there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They couldn't even give away that old First National Bank building this year and tried to pawn it off on the state.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't even sell it to the state, which them Germans tried to sell it to the state.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they asked best.
Let me ask you a related question to that. We've seen the decline of areas of downtown Atlanta. Marietta had the same problem a few years ago, and I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about the idea of a downtown Marietta Development Authority and what your role was in that.
I created it. First in the state of Georgia. It's still the best in the state of Georgia.
would you explain what made it the best, in your opinion, in the state of Georgia?
Well, it was what makes it the best in the state of Georgia is that it's a local constitutional amendment. It's a result of a local constitutional amendment.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do that anymore under the new Constitution. And what I did in the old days, I used to tinker with the Constitution a good bit.
Mm-hmm.
And as one of my ideas was to create the Downtown Development Authority of Marietta as a constitutional entity.
Mm-hmm.
And what makes Marietta's Downtown Development Authority much different from the others? The constitutional amendment, first of all, which gives it basic authorities.
Mm-hmm.
And then the legislation that comes as a result and as a power of that constitutional amendment.
Mm-hmm.
The most striking of which is a capacity to levy taxes of up to 25 mills, which is unheard of.
Mm-hmm. Nobody else has anywhere near that high of taxing power?
Very few of them have any taxing power.
Yeah.
The second one in the state of Georgia, and George Busby was a member of the House when I passed the original, which was the Downtown Marietta Development Authority. He passed one for Albany, Georgia, which is similar to Marietta, but not without half the powers. Now, we carried that through, of course, the local constitutional amendment. We were able to bring that forward under the new Constitution, and it's still in force and effect as a part of the new Constitution.
What are some of the things that the DMDA did with its taxing powers that you'd see as positive?
They've done very little. In fact, they've been so timid that they don't use the powers that they have. To do what? To help themselves. There's absolutely nothing wrong with taxing yourself and yourself alone to help yourself. It's all it is a community effort to go together and solve problems. They are at about 3 mills now, and running it like it was a scary type of situation. That, in fact, they ran me off from up there. I got to where I couldn't stand it anymore. I told them, y'all don't think big enough for me, so I left. And you might have been there.
What would you like for them to be doing with their money? Or with their
improving the town, improving the district.
What kind of things like the parking garage, is that?
Yeah. I got them 2-3 leases, and if they do it properly and do it like Ray Crawford and one other guy wants it built, then they're going to get it built.
When you say you got them 2 or 3 leases,
I got them 3
explain
leases.
that?
I extended the leases they had, which I got several years ago.
On the parking lots?
On the land.
On the land where the parking lots are?
Will be.
Or will be.
I got those 2 parking lots you see over there. And I got them out of the State Properties Commission by way of the Western Atlantic lease. That used to be railroad property.
So
both sides of the railroad.
So this took a local bill in the legislature?
Not a local bill, general bill.
A general bill?
What we call a resolution, which is a one-act law. Does one purpose, and then after it accomplishes that purpose, it has no other purpose. I passed it this session, extended those leases for 40 years.
Oh, so that's what makes it possible now for them to build that 4-decker or whatever it's going to be on the garage. So
five decks.
A 5 deck.
They just don't know yet.
They don't know yet. It's going to be one more underground or
2 underground and 3 above ground.
3 above.
There's no need, in my judgment, of building it, because you'll never go this way but once in your lifetime. There's no way. There's the only way you need to build it is to use the land to its ultimate use. Go as high as you can and be reasonable with the other buildings and make them as compatible. Then go underground as far as you can go. Go 5 stories underground if you can. I don't think they can go but 2. And I don't really know that. But it's going to take a heck of an engineer to convince me they can't go 2. And they don't really have to convince me. They have to convince my good friend Ray Crawford, who runs the State Properties Commission, who drew the act for me.
Of course, the DMDA has improved the sidewalks and such as that.
They did that with federal money. I was chairman all that time. Had they run me off before you come?
Well, you were still on when I first came on. You were there for
We used
a
to
year or
do some
two.
good things. Then it got to where it got down to where it wasn't interesting to me anymore. I didn't much, I wanted signs to be nice and neat and so forth, but I didn't want to spend my time sitting there deciding what color it's going to be.
Do you think it was a mistake when the DMDA did away with a full-time executive director?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And that was a personality thing between Mr. Crane and Mr. McLemore. Yeah, that was a mistake. I couldn't convince Mr. Crane of it. He had his prejudice, and maybe I had mine. But when he fired Mr. McLemore, or in so many terms, in words, he ordered him gone. Well, the main thing that authority's got to do is to get along with the city. They need four members of council at all times, and I always managed to have four. I could appear before council and usually in private session and get my 4 votes, and then they'd go out there in public and do what we had decided in private to do, and it worked. But at the same time, they were doing for me. I was in Atlanta doing for the city of Marietta. Lots of things.
So you scratched each other's back, in effect.
Well, one hand feeds the other in the political world, and that's the way you get things done.
If I could change,
hard to do business with your enemy.
Yeah. If I could change the subject just a little bit, I know we've been talking a long time, but if I could go just a little bit further with you, would you recall back to the conversion fight on Kennesaw College going 4 years and talk about your role in that?
Surely. That was an interesting part of my history, political history, and I learned an awful lot and used that same knowledge that I learned at Kennesaw to convert Southern Tech to 4. Identical, same situation. What you have to do to convert from 2 to 4 years is get the approval of the Board of Regents. Well, how do you get the approval of the Board of Regents is, of course, the basic question. So I guess you're asking me, how did we go about getting the approval of the Board of Regents? Well, first we elected a governor who promised us that he would go from 2 years to 4 years. That governor was named George Busby. And we did everything we could on behalf of George Busby. And he knew it, and he recognized it. Then, shortly into his term, he had 3 or 4 appointments to the Board of Regents. Now, we could have never have converted Kennesaw College from 2 to 4 years at the time in history that we did without George Busby and those appointees that he had appointed to the Board of Regents. And through the good doctor up there who had friends, and I'm talking about of a person. Well, we're talking about the conversion.
Yes,
Well, Dr. Sturgis, as I said, had friends, and one particular, been a lifelong friend of his, and we used that. And we used the powers that Al and I had in the General Assembly, and mostly we used Busby. And what it was a matter of rounding up the votes on the Board of Regents to do the conversion from 2 to 4 years. Well, it wasn't easy, but and it was a lesson in politics as to who could get to who and why. And it worked out beautifully, in that, and I'll use Dr. Sturgis as an example of a person that he had influence on. Dr. Sturgis was a personal friend of a friend of mine by the name of Clarence Vaughn, who was the majority leader of the House, and he lived in Conyers. Well, it just so happens that for some reason or another, the good Dr. Sturgis and his wife were close friends of the Vaughns and their parents. And so all I had to do was get the good doctor to get Vaughn on the telephone.
Uh-huh.
And this is an example of how it worked. Clarence Vaughn had a man that lived in his community of Conyers on the Board of Regents.
Uh-huh.
So we used Vaughn in his personal relationship with Dr. Sturgis and his wife, Miss Sturgis,
Mm-hmm.
to ask the good man member from Conyers
Mm-hmm.
to vote on our behalf.
Uh-huh.
And he did. Then you had Busby's 2 or 3 appointments, 3 I think,
Uh-huh.
new appointments. And all the good governor had to do was call him and say, I sure wished you'd do this for me, old pal.
Mm-hmm.
And they did it.
Mm-hmm.
Then we sent, I'll just give you another example of a local man having influence with the Board of Regents. There was a man in the newspaper business over in East Georgia. I forget what the name is. But he ran a newspaper in the same town that Bill Kinney's wife came from.
Uh-huh.
Well, we sent her home
Uh-huh.
to talk to the fellow that wrote the paper over there,
Uh-huh.
who was a member of the Board of Regents.
I see. Uh-huh.
That girl,
So,
Miss Bill Kinney,
mm-hmm.
went home and talked to her old friend
Yeah.
in the same business
Uh-huh.
that her husband was
Uh-huh.
in the newspaper business.
So she swayed a vote then.
Well, you'd like to think that she did.
Uh-huh.
And I'll tell you this, she sure didn't hurt the cause none.
No.
So that's the way you round up votes.
Mm-hmm.
And the conversion, we learned there about how you talk to regents
Mm-hmm.
and use that same information on the conversion of Southern Tech. To
I was
4 years.
thinking that Southern Tech was 4 years before us.
No.
Did I have that back?
No, you got it back.
Okay.
They was under the domain of Georgia
Yeah.
Tech.
Uh-huh.
And I'm talking about domain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Georgia Tech treated them like a damn orphan.
Mm-hmm.
Give them old second-hand
Mhm.
equipment,
Yeah.
old damn wore-out junk.
Mm-hmm.
Before I created the Equipment Needs Study Committee,
Mm-hmm.
Southern Tech didn't have nothing.
Uh-huh.
Now go over there and look.
Yeah. So they're doing a lot better now that, and so you learned in the fight with Kennesaw how to prepare for the fight that would separate Southern Tech from the control of
Georgia Tech.
Georgia Tech.
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
And then George Busby did this honor to me. Oh no, Tom Murphy. Busby created the higher education group to study the financing of higher education in Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
They put me on there.
Uh-huh.
I made a lot of friends.
Mm-hmm.
First name now.
Mm-hmm.
Never heard of them before.
Hmm.
And we
Mhm.
wrote what you use today as a formula
Uh-huh.
for the financing of higher education in Georgia.
Uh-huh.
The latest thing having been the insertion of $10 million as a quality item in
Mhm.
this year's budget.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
$10 million sticking out there like a sore thumb.
Yeah.
Not a soul ever even
Uh-huh.
put a hand on it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that we have a fundamentally good system in Georgia with the regents set up the way that they are? And I know the regents. Well, let me just ask you, how do you think the system works?
The system works good, and it's a member of the Board of Regents is, of course, supposed to act as a member of the Board of Directors of a
Mhm.
corporate or public entity.
Mm-hmm.
It, to an extent, is ceremonial
Mm-hmm.
and an honorary type of
Mhm.
position.
Mm-hmm.
Who does the real work is in all organization. It's the
Yeah.
staff and
Mhm.
and the professionals.
Yeah.
And does the system work it works in this sense, that it divorces itself from day-to-day politics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, it's an excellent system of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
I went to the University of North Carolina not long ago, to the chancellor of the University System of North Carolina. It's somewhat just the opposite up there.
Mm-hmm.
One man runs the whole show.
Mm-hmm.
He even has in North Carolina his own liaison
Mm-hmm.
out of his office
Mm-hmm.
to the General Assembly of North Carolina.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And as a result of that, their school system up in North Carolina, although it's probably better financed and everything than ours, it has a lot of fragmentation to it.
Yeah. Each institution for
Kind of on its
itself.
own bottom
Mhm.
and fighting each other.
Mm-hmm.
Where we have some of that, and I think some of it's healthy,
Mm-hmm.
but it kind of stops at the chancellor's office.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And if he gets out of hand, of course, you've got the board.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you see your role as increasingly one where you're involved in statewide issues as opposed to local issues, or has there been an evolution throughout your political career? Do you
Well,
think
as you
that-
gather more power to yourself and an ability to do things,
Mhm.
you get involved in more important issues, or at
Mhm.
least they're important in your mind.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, I've had an evolution,
Mhm.
especially since becoming chairman of Ways and
Mhm.
Means,
Mm-hmm.
of more important statewide, even
Mhm.
nationwide sorts of
Mhm.
things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let me just ask you a few quick questions, if I could, to wind things up, perhaps about a few of the governors in your time. Maybe we could just run down the list. How would you evaluate Lester Maddox as governor of Georgia?
A good man and a poor governor.
You think so?
Yeah. His heart was always in the right
Mhm.
place. I never found it out of place.
Mhm.
He didn't know anything about government.
Mm-hmm. So you don't think he really accomplished?
Well, he accomplished what I'm pleased that he accomplished, an independent legislature.
Uh-huh. I see. What about Jimmy Carter and government reorganization? Do you think it worked, that it was a good idea? That
Not really. It sounded good on paper,
mm-hmm.
but it's really never worked.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I see every day now a restructuring,
Mm-hmm.
a taking apart
Mhm.
Carter's
Mm-hmm.
grand scheme.
So would you evaluate Carter as a weak governor or a
Well, we had the
consequential?
perception that he was weak.
Mhm. Did it surprise
And I
you?
think generally the people had the perception that he was a weak governor.
Did it surprise you when he announced he was running for president?
Yes, sir. It certainly did.
Did you support him in his race for president?
I voted for George Wallace
You did.
in the primary.
Mm-hmm. The next governor, Busby, you've given us kind of two versions of Busby. When you were describing him as a legislator, you kind of described him as a person who absorbed all power to himself and
He did.
maybe was of limited ability. And then when you're talking about his governorship, you were saying that he really delivered for Cobb County.
There's no relationship between the two.
Is that right?
No, sir. A man gave his promise and he kept it.
Uh-huh.
That's as far as the governor was concerned.
Uh-huh.
I think Busby will go down in history as a governor, as a kind of a lackadaisical type of fellow who had a camera in his hand and wanted to go to Japan all the time, and
You think
didn't
that's
do
all
it.
he did?
And didn't do a lot of governing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But a good fellow that kept his promise,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
He promised us two things, or three things, and I remember two of them. One was the college,
Mm-hmm.
2 to 4.
Uh-huh.
The other was the completion of I-75,
Uh-huh.
and he did that.
Uh-huh.
And I think the other was a vocational school.
Was it?
I can't recall.
Oh, it seems like there was something about the underpass.
Loop.
On
Loop.
the loop. Uh-huh.
Marietta Luth.
Mm-hmm.
That was the three things we asked him to do, and he delivered on all three.
What about Carter and quality basic, not Carter, Harris and quality basic education? I believe you were a strong supporter of Joe Frank Harris when he was running.
Well, yeah, I was one of his early supporters, and I had him when we were opening up a headquarters here in Cobb County, and he had 3% name recognition. He, as I told a group here in Marietta this week, he'll go down in history as the man who attempted to do something about the education of the less fortunate in our society.
Mm-hmm.
And for that, I give him great thanks.
Mm-hmm.
That he took that ball and he ran with it. And
as a result comes this vision of QBE. And if the educators and the politicians don't kill it, it'll be the godsend for all our people. Which, what it does really, it's a basis of all of us going together to bring the least among us educationally up to snuff. And that's the theory of it, and that's the beauty of it. It's that we're willing to share our resources in a rich county like Cobb to help the less fortunate. I call it a Robin Hood program that has virtue. And if the teachers don't talk it to death, and the educators don't use it as a tool to try to do it only for their own profession, and the politicians will leave it alone and don't bend to every little pressure, I believe it will ultimately be the success that everybody envisages it to be. Now, how you go about financing those sorts of things is where the rub begins to come in, and it's beginning to come a little bit now. That Harris is kind of running out of money. He's buying everything on credit right now, bonding and so forth.
He's been able to get away with it because of an expanding economy.
The economy has given him, in round figures, a 10% increase each year he's been in there. But in 1988-89, the projection is it'll be less than 8%, which is a downturn. That means you'll have as much money, but you won't have any increase. And QBE requires increase. Now, where you're going to get that money is another thing. It's even been suggested this year, in the last few weeks, that you go up on the sales tax, which would produce about $700 million to pump into it. I happen to believe that's not too good an idea until you exhaust other methods, because sales tax is regressive on poor people, terribly regressive.
Do you favor an income tax increase if you have to increase something?
Well, I would prefer that. You know, the old saying, especially one among Ways and Means folks, is you got to get it from them that's got it. And the pensioners, the widows, and those on retirement don't necessarily have it. I'm a great guy for taxing, first of all, a user doing the paying as far as practical. And getting back to the theory of those that you have to get it out of them. Else there ain't no blood in no turnip. You got to get it from them that's got it. And in that sense, I think that a progressive income tax is probably fairer with a mix of basic sales tax than any other way you can tax people. The basic of sales tax gets the lowest among us, who usually require the most services. It requires them to have some input. Then after you meet a certain level, then you go to a system of them that's got it, does the rest of the paying. And that's where a progressive income tax comes in.
One final topic, if I could ask, and that has to do with the growth of the Republican Party in Cobb County and what the future holds for the Democrats. Could you talk a little bit about
Surely.
Why do you think the Republican Party has been growing?
Well, it's popular in this United States today to be what I'm just going to call as a general classification, a yuppie. How is a yuppie typified? It all boils down to greed. And it all is personal greed. In other words, he's drawing all the wealth he can to himself. And it's symbolized today by country club memberships,
Mm-hmm.
fancy foreign cars,
Mm-hmm.
limited, unlimited almost credit cards
Mm-hmm.
to show off to your friends and your neighbors and so
Mhm.
forth.
Mm-hmm.
It's a show. It's a charade.
Mm-hmm.
It's really a cosmetic introspection of a person before they've ever really gotten any real class.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's a show.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, it's right popular today.
Mm-hmm.
But I see this, and I think I do, even those yuppies, once they've experienced all of these wonderful things that they thought they wanted, are searching out for more.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm not mistaken, they're turning to human needs and
Mhm.
other folks' human suffering,
Trying to find some meaning for their own
some
lives.
purpose
Mm-hmm.
for their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, I see a turnaround.
Mm-hmm.
It may take 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
You may have to go through this prissy bush age,
Mhm.
you know,
Mm-hmm.
of still
Mhm.
of country
Preppy.
country club type.
Yeah.
But I think the realization is setting in.
Mm-hmm.
But there's more to life
Mm-hmm.
than a tennis court, a golf course,
Uh-huh.
a sob.
So you sound like somebody who really believes in the Democratic Party of the Franklin Roosevelt spirit, maybe of.
Well, that's the only place I learned it was that what I think we band together for
Mhm.
is to help each other.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Um,
You're going to be surprised that a lot of people call me a moss-back conservative. Have you ever heard that expression used on me?
well, I think I have.
Do you really and truly know what I am?
Well, you don't sound that much like a moss-back conservative from what we're talking about today. You sound like a good Franklin Roosevelt New Deal Democrat.
Well, how about trying a populist?
Is that the term you prefer
Yes,
to
sir.
describe yourself?
Yes, sir.
As a populist?
Yes, sir.
Mhm.
I am a populist,
Mm-hmm.
but I have to play a conservative game,
Uh-huh.
else you don't fit into that power structure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I only break out on such things as taking this tax off of medicine.
Mm-hmm.
I only break out when you see me come for such things as income tax relief for the elderly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I come out of my shell when you see me coming out for a road program, help finance for a short period of time. I sock it to everybody for a short period of time to
Mhm.
solve the road problem.
Mm-hmm.
Do I think that's fair?
Mm-hmm.
Nah, that ain't fair. But it's a way to do it.
Mhm.
And it's almost painless way to do it. And it
Mhm.
makes everybody
Mhm.
involved.
Mm-hmm.
That's my kind of politics and that's my kind of doing thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's my philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
But I've also learned early that you gotta go along to get along.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's just how far are you willing
Yeah.
to go along
Uh-huh.
before your own conscience sets in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think I have a low tolerance
Uh-huh.
for unconscionables.
Mm-hmm.
The Republican Party, I would say it would probably have some more gains. But what good does it do to have representation that's really not representation?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In other words, what good does it do the people to have representation when their representation can't accomplish anything?
Mm-hmm. You're talking about the fact that even if we elected a solidly Republican delegation, the Democrats are going to control the legislature? Is that what you have in mind?
For
or-
your lifetime and your children's lifetime, yes,
Uh-huh.
sir.
Yeah.
Did you see the vote the other day, which was 61%, in Super Tuesday, it was 61% without a strong single
Mhm.
Democratic candidate. 61% of all of Georgia voted Democratic,
Uh-huh.
and 39 voted Republican.
Uh-huh. And in Cobb, it was just about reverse, I guess.
Well, East Cobb was about 10,000 or 9,000 ahead
Mhm.
for the Republicans, the
Mhm.
yuppie crowd. And over in West Cobb, it was
Mhm.
almost a washout.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they came out slightly ahead in West Cobb.
Mm-hmm.
Marietta came out 500 votes
Yeah.
in favor of Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
And for the first time in history, Professor, you listen to this now. 2 districts, South Cobb, traditionally, you talk about traditional Republicans
Mm-hmm.
districts, traditionally Democrat, leaning a little bit towards Republican.
Mm-hmm.
Now listen to this. They went for Jesse Jackson.
Is that right?
Howell's number 1 and Howell's number 2.
Went for Jesse Jackson?
Yes, sir.
How do you account for that?
Blacks moving in from Atlanta.
Uh-huh.
Same thing had happened in southwest DeKalb County.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. So you think that the Republicans are going to continue to expand their influence in Cobb for a few more years, but that the Democrats are going to have a comeback?
Well, if it be Democrats or whatever, if we're not careful in this nation of ours, what we're fast coming to, in my judgment, is this. You're fast coming, and it's happening more rapid than I ever thought it would under a capitalist system even, that you're going from the haves and you're separating to the have-nots
Mm-hmm.
in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always been this situation in the world,
Mm-hmm.
that you are fast becoming, if not, you're not classless anymore. You come into a class society in America,
Mm-hmm.
with the haves being those that we described a little earlier,
Yeah.
and the nots, have-nots.
Mm-hmm.
And then in my judgment, you're going to have a complete revolution, which will be a complete realignment of all the national parties.
Mm-hmm.
And it will probably, non-people types will be in, robot types will be in one party,
Mm-hmm.
and old activists trying to claw their way up the ladder crowd will be in the other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't think that communism will work in this country as it does in lots of those countries where they have absolutely
Mm-hmm.
have-nots for so
Mhm.
long and have been beaten down and downtrodden. I think our people are accustomed to a society in which competition
Mm-hmm.
is the,
Uh-huh.
but unfair competition is what will drive,
Mm-hmm.
be the driver of the rich taking advantage of the poor,
Mm-hmm.
the unfair competition.
Mm-hmm.
Now, who describes what's unfair and unfair is a different question,
Mm-hmm.
but that's where you're going, and maybe in your lifetime.
You sound very much like a radical of the 60s.
I don't know what a radical of the 60s is. You talking about them Reuben types? Them damn crazy?
Well, maybe not quite that far, but that sense of social conscience and so on.
I think there's an increasing sense of social conscience, but not in the wild way that you were talking about, those 60s.
Uh-huh.
I think that even the responsibles, those among us who think they are responsible
Mm-hmm.
and like to describe themselves as being solid, responsible citizens,
Mm-hmm.
are getting more and more a sense of social responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's really what we were discussing a while ago.
Yeah. Was Huey Long a hero for you?
No, sir. Not
So-
Bill Bowl? No, sir.
Tom Watson?
Yes, sir.
Watson was a hero?
He is my hero.
Is that right?
Reading that little old book, you just happened to bring that up.
Profiles in Populism, huh? That's great.
I just happened to be reading that. I bought one yesterday.
Have you ever read C. Van Woodward's biography of Tom Watson?
No, sir. I bought that one yesterday, and I've been
Trial of
concerned.
Socrates by
I've been
A.F. Stone.
I've been concerned about why they wanted to make Socrates drink the hemlock.
Mm-hmm.
And IF says he's going to tell me about it. You know Izzy Stone?
Well, the I.F. Stone I'm familiar with was a longtime journalist. Is that
That's him.
someone? Mm-hmm, that
Right,
very much on
maverick type of.
the left wing of the spectrum?
No.
Not really a left wing, you wouldn't
No.
describe him?
No.
He used to have
Wasn't
a paper,
exactly.
didn't he? The
Yeah.
I.F. Stone Weekly or
Weekly.
something. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But he kind of anti-establishment.
Uh-huh.
kind of like Tom Watson.
Uh-huh.
My kind of guy.
What was there? Is that the anti-establishment that you liked about Tom Watson?
Yeah. That he was people-oriented
Mhm.
instead of institutional-oriented.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He fought the Bourbons, which
Yeah.
were the aristocratic
Mm-hmm.
pretenders.
Mm-hmm.
They would be damn good yuppie Republicans today.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the leaders of the leaders.
Yeah. Tom Watson went kind of sour later on, though, with his anti-Catholicism and his anti-Semitism.
He got anti-everything, and he
Yeah.
always pretended he wasn't anti-black, but that's
Yeah.
what hung him together at that, in that 1916, 18, 20
Yeah.
society. You had to be,
Uh-huh.
you had to be anti-black.
So it's
But now he had suffered under blacks himself.
we're talking about the Reconstruction period.
No, I'm talking about when in his early political life, when they would buy those blacks,
Oh,
line them up
yeah,
and vote them
when he
against
got knocked out of Congress.
That's right.
Mhm.
He never became a leader till he got out of politics.
So you're talking. So what you really like was the Tom Watson of the populist era.
I don't like any other Tom Watson.
Yeah, not the Tom Watson later on.
The racist,
Yeah,
the anti-Catholic,
yeah,
and so
yeah.
ain't none of that in me.
Well, that's very interesting. Well, I sure.
My wife fusses me because I don't have prejudices against certain types of people. You know,
Is that right?
I just don't have.
Well, I certainly have enjoyed talking to
Well,
you
I
today,
enjoyed
and I
talking to you.
think I've learned a great deal. I've learned I've been watching your political career through the newspapers at least for the last 20 years, and I think I've learned a great deal more talking to you today than I've gotten out of the Marietta Journal over the years at any rate.
Well, they have a habit of printing it the way they want it to come out. And, they don't dislike me, but they don't really like me either. They kind of establishment, and they kind of feel maybe, without me telling them, that I'm kind of anti-establishment.
Well, I've certainly enjoyed talking to you today.
Well, I enjoy talking to you.
Appreciate the fact that you take the time to do it.
Yes, sir, I enjoy it.